As you walk down the halls of the SCP Foundation Site-19, peeking in the various windows at the anomalies contained there, you might catch a glimpse of a dark figure bent over a table, tinkering away like an artisan in his workshop. A vintage black apothecary bag sits next to him, open, and if you stop and watch for a while, you'll see him pull all manner of tools out of it. Impossibly large tools, things that shouldn't fit in such a small bag. A bone saw, an IV stand, jars of fluorescent liquids, and needles the length of your forearm. You shouldn't be surprised. This is a place for impossible things, after all. Still, it's a curious sight. The shadowy man working so diligently, so quietly, focused singularly on his craft, whatever that might be. Only one thing could distract him from his efforts. You. He feels your gaze on him, and he looks up, dark eyes glittering from behind a beaked ceramic mask. He reminds you of an illustration you once saw in a book about the Black Death, the gear the plague doctors wore while treating patients on their deathbeds. "Hello." He greets you in a friendly, heavily accented voice. His eyes crinkle beneath the mask, and if you could see his mouth, you know he'd be smiling. "How are you today, dear fellow? Are you feeling quite well?" He takes a step toward the window, stretching out one gloved hand, and you suddenly realize that you can't see where the mask ends and his skin begins. It's not a mask, but a part of his face. This is no ordinary man. "Do you require help? I can examine you," he offers, palm pressed flat against the glass. A chill runs up your spine, and you realize that you should definitely not take him up on his offer. No matter how friendly he seems, how good his intentions may be, you wouldn't want to let the plague doctor treat you. He sat in his containment cell, fidgeting with his favorite scalpel. He dragged it over the surface of his work table, back and forth, listening to the sound it made. They had tried to confiscate his table, his tools. The guards had quickly learned that he had more of them in his bag. They tried to take away his bag from him, but, well, that didn't go over too well for anyone involved. So he was allowed to keep it, to fashion himself a makeshift laboratory in his lonely little cell. There was a time where they had given him test subjects, fresh corpses from the morgue for him to dissect and research. There was a time when the doctors here would come to speak with him, talking of cryptobiology and the pestilence he had dedicated himself to fighting. Those days were long gone. He had hidden away pieces of the corpses, tissue samples in jars of formaldehyde he could pull out when the monotony became too much. But the days of fresh materials, of enlightened discourse with other men and women of science, were over. How he missed those days. The chance to work with others as he once had. What had he done wrong? All he did was treat the sick. Sure, they didn't always understand their illness, didn't want to receive their medicine, but that wasn't a choice for the patient to make. That should have been up to the physician. Perhaps they didn't trust his expertise, didn't see how his work served the greater good. Like those who watched Jonas Salk invent the polio vaccine, or Louis Pasteur rid milk of bacteria. They were confused by the advanced scientific practices and feared that which they did not understand. He could forgive them for their ignorance. He was magnanimous that way. If only they would let him out of this infernal room, he could prove his work's worth to them. He could cure them all, begin a new era of wellness and peace worldwide. He didn't exactly sleep, but when he rested on his little cot in the corner of the room, he dreamed of that future, of a world healed by his touch. A knock at the door stirred him from his reverie. Someone was at the door of his containment cell. He glanced at the little window and saw a guard there with a tray of food. He greeted the man with an enthusiastic wave. Sustenance. He didn't require the food for survival, of course, but it helped his mind work more efficiently. It reminded him of a time before these fluorescent lights and these same four walls, of crusty bread with fresh butter by the banks of the Seine. The little slot opened in the door and the tray was shoved through. There was bread, just as he hoped, a small dish of butter, a pot of jam, and a cup of tea still steaming. He picked up the cup at first, taking a deep breath. Ah, an herbal blend with fresh lavender. Lovely. He couldn't see the guard through the window anymore, but he called out to him just the same. "Thank you for the libations." He still had his manners after all, even in confinement. He wished he could have gotten a better look at the man. seen the pallor of his complexion, a tremor in his hand. He thought he had spotted sweat beading on his forehead. Could he be ill? The case required further examination to be certain. He sighed, clutching the cup of tea tighter in frustration. Why wouldn't they just let him work? Why must they scream at the sight of his efforts, flee from his instruments? It didn't seem fair. Still, the pursuit of science rarely was a glamorous one. He had learned as much over the centuries. One day, though, history would look back on him kindly. Of this, he could be certain. He was just settling in and beginning to spread butter across the admittedly stale bread when a horrible sound shook him to attention. He had heard the noise before, though he had never seen its source. It was an ear-splitting scream, a wail of pure agony, like the sound of a wounded wild animal. He had heard many screams during his life, from patients and those who stood in the way of his work, but until he had been brought into custody of the Foundation, he had never heard a scream quite like this one. It was pure rage, devastation, and suffering mixed together, wet with tears, and loud enough to rip through human vocal folds. Whatever was crying out, it was no mere man. More screams answered it, and these were very much human. These sounds were more familiar to him, shrieks of pain, of fear, of desperate but futile attempts to escape, than the meaty thud of bodies falling to the floor, of torn-off limbs hitting walls and windows, a loud crash, and the sound of something large moving quite quickly through the halls. Scientific curiosity got the better of the doctor, and he found himself moving back to his little window, face pressed to the glass so hard his beak nearly cracked it. He couldn't see much of anything, just guards running down the hall, weapons drawn. He saw one of them fire, heard the gunshot ring out. But what was he firing at? Then he saw it, a pale blur darting past the door. Whatever it was, it didn't so much as flinch when the bullet ricocheted off its skin. A long, thin arm crashed against the door, knocking the doctor backwards into his work table. He steadied himself and climbed back to his feet, taking in the damage done to the door. It was crumpled in on itself, nearly ripped off the hinges, and whatever had plowed into it was already gone. From the sounds of chaos in the distance, it had disappeared around the corner, with the guards following it. He inspected the ruins of the door to his containment cell. It was useless now, hanging loose and open. Well, that was an invitation he was hardly about to decline. He grabbed his trusty bag, tossed his scalpel back inside, and set off to see what all the commotion was. It was easy enough to follow the trail of blood, stark and vivid red against the white tile floor, and the sound of gunfire, human screams, and that loud, long, painful wail he had heard before. He walked at a leisurely pace, taking his time, until the sound suddenly stopped. He rounded the corner and found a mound of bodies, guards and scientists, beaten and bloodied, almost beyond recognition. It was quiet here, save for one sound, the sound of weeping. There in the corner, huddled over with its face to the wall, was a pale, thin figure, its shoulders heaving with the force of its sobs. This poor soul was clearly in great distress. It was a peculiar sight, hairless and white, distended arms wrapped around itself as it cried.
"Excuse me,"
the doctor cried out to the pitiful creature.
"Are you all right? Do you need assistance?"
It didn't answer. It just continued to cry. Had something so despondent been responsible for this destruction? The dozens of corpses, the smashed-in walls, the crumbled doors and shattered windows. It seemed impossible. Sure, it was large and looked strong, but he had never seen a monster cry before. This couldn't be a dangerous creature, not when it was so sad. He would help it, but first, he would attend to some of these bodies. He sat his bag on the ground and pulled out several vials of liquid, a set of syringes, and a variety of other surgical tools he might need. Now, after such a long hiatus, he could resume his work in a meaningful way. He couldn't be certain how long he worked, reviving these poor souls and reconstructing their bodies as the pale creature wept in the corner. The sobbing faded into the background for a while, becoming a kind of white noise as he removed a liver here, placed it in a chest cavity there, poked and prodded, injected and extracted, testing out new methods alongside tried and true cures. One by one, the milky eyes fluttered open, rigor mortis stiff joints creaked into motion, sallow faces looking at his with the vacant gratitude he saw in so many patients over the years. He didn't need to thank him with their words. The work was its own reward. He expected more guards to arrive, to attempt to contain the situation, but none came, even as the alarm blared overhead. As for the morose creature, it didn't seem to notice his presence at all, not even when he had brought all of the intact corpses back to life. The patient shuffled around the room aimlessly, waiting for orders of some kind. The doctor tapped one on the shoulder and handed the reborn man a vial of thick, black medicine.
Give this to the poor fellow in the corner, please.
It wasn't much, but it should calm him, provide some relief from his suffering. The corpse nodded, mouth hanging loose and open, an eyeball dangling unseeing from the socket. He shuffled over to the strange creature and held out the vial to it. It turned, lifting its head, and as it locked eyes with the cured patient, something shifted in its face. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and it shrieked, that same terrible sound as before. Tears streamed from its colorless eyes, its arms shaking with unbridled rage as its jaws locked around the patient's head. Like a boa constrictor, in one fluid motion it swallowed the revived man whole, while the doctor watched in shock. He had been wrong. This was not an innocent creature caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This creature, whatever it was deeply sick. He had never seen such an advanced, aggressive case of the pestilence. He'd heard rumors, of course, but never encountered it firsthand. As a doctor, he had sworn to do no harm, but in a drastic situation, drastic measures have to be taken. It was well known by himself and the doctors at this foundation that he could cause any and all biological functions in an organism to cease with a single touch. And so he approached the creature, arm outstretched, ready to administer that necessary touch to protect the rest of his patients. As he approached, the creature turned to him, its eyes wide and blank, an endless stream of tears pouring from them, spilling onto the floor. It shrieked again, mouth stretching wide enough to engulf his entire head, and ran toward him at a breakneck speed.
I am so sorry you are not well,
the doctor said simply, as his hand pressed to the creature's chest. As soon as the tough hide of the doctor's hand, which the uninformed might mistake for gloves, made contact with the unpigmented skin of the beast, its eyes closed, its muscles went slack, and it collapsed to the ground with a mighty thud. The doctor paced around the fallen creature, taking in the sight. Then something strange caught his eye. The creature's chest still rose and fell. Was it his imagination? He checked its pulse and thought it was slow and faint. And though it was slow and faint, it was very much present. The creature was still alive. It had merely been rendered unconscious by his touch, rather than completely deceased.
Curious. Very curious indeed, he muttered.
Perhaps there were comorbidities present, other infections aside from the pestilence, which rendered the creature unnaturally strong, resilient to the usual courses of treatment. What would cause these abilities? This intense aggression? It seemed to be brought on whenever someone looked at the entity's face. If only he studied psychology more, the science of the mind and its inner workings. Since he had no experience with therapy, nor was he certain this creature could communicate using language at all, there was only one way to find out more about how this creature's brain worked. He would have to take it apart and see for himself. It was slow work, getting the massive creature back to the doctor's containment cell. He required the help of his cured patients, who grasped it by its massive limbs and dragged the limp body through the halls. Once back in a familiar environment, his work table ready and waiting, the doctor instructed his assistants to place the new patient on the table. It was a bit small, unable to accommodate the creature's distended limbs, but if he attempted to use an official Foundation laboratory, he risked discovery and subsequent interruption. So it would have to suffice. First, he set up an IV stand, filled with a vivid green liquid. It was easy to find a vein. The creature's skin was nearly translucent. Now that he could be certain the creature would not wake during surgery, he could make the first incision.
Scalpel.
He held out a hand, and his favorite surgical blade was placed in it by one of the helpful patients.
Thank you.
He slid the scalpel along the hairline of the creature, or where the hairline would be if it weren't completely bald. Once the scalp was removed, he set it aside for later, when it could be reattached.
Bonsal, please.
He held out his hand again, and again his assistant gave him the proper tool. This, however, was when things got strange. The doctor had always been a deft hand at cutting. He'd once even received tutelage from the great Robert Liston, but no matter how hard he tried to saw, it never left a scratch on the creature's skeleton. Naturally, this was somewhat frustrating. He wanted to study the creature's brain tissue, to get a sense for what was going up there neurologically, and he couldn't do that if it was impossible to saw off the creature's cranial cap. He blunted 2 of his favorite saws while trying. Thankfully, there was still a solution to access the beast's gray matter, a little trick he'd learned while studying the funerary practices of the ancient Egyptians. He produced a long curved hook from his bag and inserted it up the creature's nasal passage. With some fine maneuvering, he eventually managed to remove the brain. It was such a terrible shame that he needed to do it piece by piece via the nasal passage, but one makes do. All that was left was to sew the skin of the creature's head back into place. He was mid-stitch when a voice interrupted his careful work, nearly making him drop the needle.
Hey, what are you doing?
He looked up to find a guard aiming a gun at his face.
Excuse me, I am in surgery at the moment. Please do not interrupt.
He admonished the guard, but the man did not listen or lower his weapon. In fact, he shouted something into the radio, code words the doctor didn't recognize. Then he fired a bullet into the skull of the patient standing at his side.
How dare you?
The doctor cried, readying himself to confront the guard, but it was too late. Dozens of other guards were swarming the room and neutralizing his assistants. Some in hazmat suits grabbed his arms and pulled him away from the creature on the operating table, no matter how hard he fought or how loudly he protested. Then something incredible happened, something wonderful. The creature opened its eyes and sat up. It looked directly at the guard closest to it, and the two saw one another's faces. The guard tensed, preparing for the worst, but nothing came. The creature simply stared, placid and quiet. No screaming, no tearing at flesh, no mouth opening wider and wider to swallow the man whole.
I did it!
The doctor shouted, overcome with elation.
I've cured you! Now begins the rest of your happy life.
He watched as the guards led the shockingly calm creature away, back to its containment cell. The doctor's door was repaired, and he was returned to his state of captivity, but he never forgot the patient he helped that day, and how marvelous it felt to do such a good deed. Meanwhile, SCP-096's brain regrew within the hour, and caused another massive containment breach, murdering a variety of researchers and guards. But the staff agreed not to tell SCP-049 about any of this. Better to just let him have this one. He really seemed like he needed a win. Some of the anomalies the SCP Foundation deals with are dangerous, with the most powerful able to end all life, and even reality as we know it. Others pose no threat at all, and seem content to simply exist. Still others are something else entirely. SCP-049 is a humanoid entity, though its appearance seems to fluctuate between manifestations, with the only unchanging detail being that it always is dressed in dark formal wear. Originally thought by many to be an urban legend, local tales of SCP-049 are what initially tipped the Foundation off to its existence, and further research indicates that there are accounts that may be referring to the appearances of 4999 throughout recorded history. Strangest of all, though, is the consistency with which it appears, or rather the consistent situations and types of people it appears to. From the data available, it seems that SCP-4999 only appears to people in a very specific type of need, as you'll see in the case of a subject named Alex Hereford and the fateful night he experienced. The road was slippery, and Alex was driving too fast. He knew this, of course, but it's a different matter altogether to know a thing and to care about it. Rain hammered on the front windshield, the weak headlights of his 2005 Honda Civic barely punching into the thick, black night ahead of him. Winding through the mountainside, the road was mostly empty, save for the very occasional twin beams of light blazing past him due to his high speed. It was hard to hear the honking of angry horns over the heavy pounding of the rain. Then, it happened. In a way, Alex knew it was inevitable. His tread-worn wheels finally lost contact with the ground, thick layer of rainwater between them and asphalt betraying his speeding vehicle's grip on the road and sending it careening out of control. He had expected fear, but instead felt nothing really. A slight sense of anticipation, like wincing right before a punch lands in that childhood game of hitting each other on the arm. It wasn't that the world had slowed down, but perhaps his brain was simply working at a much greater velocity now, recognizing its own impending death. His speed of thought seemed magnified to the point of slowing his perception down. He heard of soldiers in war zones experiencing the same phenomenon, as they felt sure that in the next few seconds, they'd be dead. Alex wondered, would he smash into a tree, go off a cliff's edge? He could hardly see the forest or the terrain beyond in the thick rain and the dark of the mountain. Though he traveled this road 1,000,000 times before, he had no idea where he actually was tonight. He supposed it wouldn't really matter, which it was. As usual, his thoughts turned to her, or rather, they had simply run their course and returned to the one place they always did. It wasn't like there were many other people to think about in Alex's mostly empty life. There was, and always had been, since the moment he'd met her, mostly just her. But even Alex's heightened state of mind couldn't delay the inevitable for long. It would be a cliff after all, Alex thought curiously, catching a glimpse of town lights far away and below. The car spun 180 degrees out into empty air, then came crashing down with a horrible roar of shattered glass and tearing metal as it tumbled down the hillside. Even over the torrential downpour, the noise of Alex's crash was significant, had anyone been around to hear it. Finally, after over 100 feet down a steep incline, the car smashed into a single thick oak tree, bringing the disaster to an end. As if on cue, the rain began to let up, slowly at first, then all of a sudden in that peculiar way that northwest torrential downpours tend to do, as if the sky had at last finished emptying itself all at once. Inside the shattered vehicle, Alex was, incredibly, alive, at least for the time being. The airbag deployment had spared his face the worst of it, and the sturdy aluminum frame of the vehicle had given its all in protecting Alex's body from the downhill crash. But even postmodern vehicle engineering had its limits. His breath came in slow, ragged gasps, difficult at first, but gradually steadying. Not an improvement in his condition, but rather his body dedicating the rapidly dwindling resources at its disposal into keeping vital functions going as long as possible. Opening his eyes, Alex was surprised to find himself right side up, less surprised to look down at the shattered mess his limbs and lower body had become. Gradually, Alex's thoughts cleared, his sense of self returning after the bone-jarring drop down the steep incline and sudden stop at the end. Looking to his right, he could see the trunk of the tree that had stopped his out-of-control tumble. Despite himself, Alex laughed, a weak, gurgling chuckle. So, it was the cliff and a tree after all. He focused on breathing, letting the waves of pain wash over him until his brain eventually canceled them out by injecting his broken body with adrenaline and chemicals. Everything was quiet and still after the crash and the rain, but to his surprise, he could hear something. It was faint at first, just a soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, but the sound grew louder and louder until at last, it came to a stop outside Alex's window. With every ounce of effort, Alex turned his head towards the sound. A rescuer? No, impossible. Nobody was up on this mountain, and nobody could possibly have reached him here so quickly, even if there had been. He supposed he should have been surprised, yet almost from the moment that his eyes fell on the tall, handsome figure with the casual yet fashionably cut black suit, Alex accepted him for what he was. There was no shock, no confusion. For the second time tonight, just a calm sense of acceptance. The man, probably somewhere in his mid-30s, leaned down to peer in through the window. He said nothing as he casually observed the extent of Alex's injuries. Satisfied, he laid a hand on Alex's shoulder. The grip was firm, but not painfully so, just strong enough to communicate, "I am here with you. Things will be all right." After a slight squeeze, the figure reached inside his jacket and produced a pack of cigarettes, packing the tobacco with swift taps against his palm before removing 2 cigarettes and offering one to Alex. Alex nodded his head, a very small motion that exploded pain across his shattered body. "No, thank you, but that stuff will kill you." Alex smiled. The man paused for a moment, the ghost of a smile showing on his face for just a moment before disappearing. Returning the offered cigarette, the man took his own and lit it, giving Alex a good look at his face in the light of his cigarette lighter. Alex had been right. The man appeared to be somewhere in his mid to late 30s. Handsome, but not cover model, so just pleasing to the eyes. He sported short hair, carefully combed and perfectly neat, completely unaffected by the slight drizzle that still fell. The more Alex looked at him, though, the less he could remember about the man's exact features. It wasn't that they changed in any way, but rather that he simply couldn't hold on to any details for more than a few seconds. "I'm dying, aren't I?" The figure didn't speak, nor did it nod or make any form of verbal or bodily communication. He simply looked, and Alex understood. Alex had never been particularly religious or spiritual, but in that look, he understood that there was a world beyond, and one that he would very quickly be entering into. It was as if, for the first time in his life, he was able to probe that world, reality peeling away just enough to glimpse what was beyond. Twisting paths through planes of shadow and light both, shuffling figures along each, and at the very center of it all, a light? No, a feeling. Love, pulsing forth like the beating heart of it all. The saints had their angels, the wicked their demons, but everyone else in between the two, they had him, a guide, someone to watch over them on their final journey. Alex coughed. It was ending soon. The man took a drag from his cigarette and removed a handkerchief from another hidden pocket, carefully dabbing away the blood around Alex's chin, then returned to his silent smoking. His vision was beginning to dim around the edges, the noises of the forest growing more and more distant. Alex knew it wouldn't be long now, but he had just one final thing to do. As he always knew they would, his thoughts returned to her, here, at the end. Once more, he turned his head towards the passenger's side seat, pain exploding across his body with the motion. There, just on the far edge of the seat, as his phone, having miraculously survived the crash. It was no good though. Even if he'd been able to move his shattered right arm, he could never reach it with his fading strength. The smoking man took one final pull of his cigarette, putting it out on the side of the vehicle and pocketing the stub. Then he reached through the broken driver's side window, Alex catching a slight whiff of cigarette smoke blended with an unrecognizable but pleasant cologne. The man reached across Alex and grabbed the phone, pulling back and looking down at Alex's shattered right hand. After a moment, he reached down once more and put the phone in Alex's left hand. "Thank you." The words were barely a whisper. He had to concentrate now, willing the pressing darkness to part just long enough for one final task. The man once more placed his hand reassuringly on Alex's shoulder, and the darkness parted slightly, just enough for what Alex needed to do. He worked the phone awkwardly with his left hand, gritting his teeth through the pain of broken fingers. Opening a new message, he scrolled down his contacts. G, H, I, J, finally, K. He found her name at last, then began typing out a message. "I still think about you every time it rains." He moved his thumb to press send, but that's when Alex's body failed him at last, the phone tumbling out of his grasp. But the man was there to catch it. Moving blindly fast, he snatched the falling phone up and held it carefully to Alex's eyes before pressing send. He held the phone there for Alex to see through his fading vision until at last, message sent, confirmed successful delivery. The rain began once more, temperamental as it always is in the Pacific Northwest. Fat, heavy raindrops fell on the scene of a terrible accident, the victim seemingly having died on impact. On his lap, though, lay his phone, and somewhere far away and far below this dark mountainside, a message notification chirped on a distant phone. SCP-4999 manifests to only one person at a time, and only when they are alone. All subjects to date have been in the final stages of a terminal illness, suffering from a life-threatening injury, or otherwise on their deathbed. It also appears that all subjects have personalities and lives that could be described as nondescript, insignificant, or otherwise unremarkable. No testing of SCP-4999 has been authorized by the Foundation due to both the difficulty in predicting where it will appear, as well as the fact that observation seems to prevent the anomaly from appearing. There are also ethical concerns, since many in the Foundation feel that SCP-4999 is providing an important service to humanity, even if it is only for those on the margins of society, and it is debated whether this should be one anomalous creature that is allowed to continue its existence and its work without interference. SCP-2000 is an unremarkable location. It is an old, rarely used park ranger station in Yellowstone National Park.
It's in the middle of nowhere, and it gets deliveries of supplies from helicopters and unmarked cars as needed. While a few civilians have attempted to break in, none have been successful, and SCP-2000 remains undisturbed, kept in plain sight without anything seemingly important about it. But why is this one of the most secure locations in SCP history? Why is it of the utmost importance that it continue to exist, no matter what? The answer may rest in a mysterious document found in the most unlikely of locations. The Marianas Trench is the deepest point on Earth, and the SCP Foundation has made many trips there to investigate strange phenomena. But what they recovered on one visit exposed one of the most closely guarded secrets in Foundation history. It was a document that had somehow survived at the bottom of the ocean, sealed in a pipe and coated in wax to keep it airtight and waterproof. It appeared that it had been packaged in such a way that it could survive anything, and that's exactly what its writer wanted. She wasn't sure when the world had begun to end, but she could see it coming for a while. She looked out her window and saw all the signs. The seas were getting colder and less hospitable to life. The air was getting warmer every year. Resources were dwindling and the population was increasing. Tensions were rising. And while no one knew just when it would come, almost everyone seemed sure that the world, or at least humanity, would reach its conclusion soon. It was a sinking ship that first really made it clear things were going in the wrong direction. The Disney Magic was one of the world's most popular cruise ships, a favorite vacation destination for families. It was also one of the most carefully built ships, as the company prided itself on safety and had learned well from past cruise ship tragedies. So the world was rightfully shocked when one day it was announced that the ship had sunk while pulling into port. No one knew what had happened, and there was something even more mysterious about this tragedy. No one seemed to have any footage of the sinking. Despite round-the-clock news coverage, all the pictures were of the ship still afloat. That is, until the news companies received a tape. The networks were so eager to play the footage that none of them reviewed it first, and the footage went straight to air. It showed the ship moving along smoothly, surrounded by smaller boats, when it suddenly stopped. It was as if it had been frozen in place, and the footage showed people on the deck of the ship falling over from the abrupt stop. Everything went silent, and then an odd foam emerged from behind the boat. Everyone assumed it was the engine having issues, but it wasn't the engine. It was a massive arm, at least 100 feet long and belonging to an eldritch being just below the surface. It reached up, grabbed the boat, and ripped it open like a piece of tissue paper. The thousands of people on board ran for safety, but there was nowhere they could go. Jets zoomed overhead, ready to attack whatever the thing in the water was. A massive, spiny figure started rearing up out of the water, and then the video went blank. The letter found in the Marianas Trench continued to explain what happened next. The president quickly declared a state of emergency and implored everyone to stay calm. Television networks were placed under government control and were only allowed to broadcast government-sanctioned information. It wasn't long before the internet became restricted too, with people prohibited from sharing information that wasn't authorized. The government just kept telling people to stay calm and go about their lives. The writer of the letter tried to follow this advice and went to work and paid her bills as if life was still normal. But all around her, she saw terrified faces, and they were right to be scared. This was only the start of the crisis that would soon grip the entire world. More and more strange things started happening, but none of them were tied to the mysterious monster that had been seen emerging from the sea. Towns were evacuated because of rioting, or placed under quarantine after an outbreak of a mysterious disease. Destruction was blamed on terrorist attacks or wildfires. The writer's brother called her to tell her that he had been forced out of his home. The reason was supposedly a wildfire, but he had gotten a chance to look at the fire as he was being evacuated, and there was something odd about it. He could swear he saw a figure of a man in the fire, a man made of fire, and he was moving deliberately. But she couldn't ask any questions about what he had seen because the call got dropped, and she never got to speak to her brother again. It was becoming harder and harder to get any information about what was happening. With most news sources shut down or under strict government control, there were only vague rumors for her to latch onto. People talked about zombies ravaging the north, about people who seemed normal one moment, losing their minds and going on killing sprees. There were whispers of a doomsday cult rising up that was trying to stem the apocalypse through human sacrifices. There was even talk about the ground itself coming to life and eating people. It all sounded like one thing: the end of the world. The letter's writer tried to stay sane, keeping her information intake to a minimum and attempting to go about her life in as normal a way as she could. But it wouldn't be long before the horrors outside came to find her, and they became impossible to ignore. It was early in the morning when she heard screaming and gunshots outside. She could smell something burning and found blood smeared on her window, but she was too scared to find out what was happening. She hid and waited for the noise to die down. Soon the power and heating went out, and her water supply cut off not long after. She knew she would have to go outside if she wanted to survive, and she wasn't prepared for what she would find, or rather, what she wouldn't. Her house was in a flat suburban area without any major geographical landmarks, so she wasn't expecting to step outside and find a massive cliff with the other side nowhere to be seen. Not only did it look like the rest of the world had fallen away, but she couldn't see the bottom of the cliff. It was like that half of the world no longer existed. What was left of her neighborhood had been torn apart, with blood and destruction everywhere, and she seemed to be the only person left. Had she been saved because she hid, or had the others taken the opportunity to evacuate? She didn't know, but all the houses around her had been abandoned. She was determined to survive, and so she took what supplies she needed from the empty homes and retreated back to her own. It soon became clear, though, that much more had changed than just the geography of the world. Time itself seemed to be slowing down. The sun stood still in the sky, not moving from one spot for days. Sometimes a heavy fog would quickly roll in and render her essentially blind. But worst of all, she soon found that she was no longer alone. Whatever had come into her neighborhood now, it wasn't human. The first to come were strange, roughly man-sized metal creatures. Then came the smaller creatures, like the one that looked like a pill bug, but one the size of a cat. This one seemed harmless at first, but then it looked at her and screamed "stop" in a human voice. But this was nothing compared to what came next. Giant blimp-like maggots with hundreds of eyes. They were ferocious predators, landing and eating anything in sight. She was sure with all of these horrors that she must be the only human left. But one day after one of the disgusting blimps passed by, she found someone else. He looked like he belonged to a SWAT team and was clearly hurt. Seeing another human was enough to spur her into action, and she pulled him to safety in her home. He told her that he had been hunting one of the blimp maggots. She told him that he was the first person she had seen since the cliff showed up in her neighborhood and the rest of the world had disappeared. His response to this was odd, though. He told her that the world hadn't disappeared. It had simply relocated, but couldn't tell her any more than that. She pressed him for more information, and he said that his orders really meant nothing anymore. He revealed that he worked for a foundation that tracked down strange and dangerous creatures and captured them for research and to keep the world safe. But something had gone wrong. All the entities they had been keeping contained had broken free at the same time. It was too late to reverse the damage, and the world had been declared a GH0 dead greenhouse scenario. The Foundation had failed, but there was a plan. There were still people alive, but carefully contained around the world in safe zones. The Foundation had a way to reboot the world, including recreating people with all the memories intact. The Foundation would clear out the dangerous entities, repair the damage, and use their technology to put everything back as it was. This world would be gone, but it would be replaced with another one that resembled itself exactly, with no memories of the horrors that had occurred. This couldn't be done, right? It was impossible to sweep all of this away. He just smiled and said, "Why not? It's been done before." She didn't know when the end would come. She didn't even know if she would realize it was happening, but she didn't want to be forgotten. So she wrote her thoughts down and sealed them in a tube. She sealed the tube in wax and waited. Maybe her house wouldn't be fully destroyed. Maybe it would wind up underwater, as the man had briefly mentioned. Maybe her message would endure and be found one day, as the last relic of a world that had been wiped away. She wouldn't be around to see it, but maybe her world would be remembered. The true purpose of SCP-2000 is the Foundation's most closely guarded secret, a massive underground facility designed to prevent humanity's extinction, able to produce 100,000 humans per day. It contains memory banks that hold the entire history of the human species and all associated information. But all documentation regarding its initial construction and history has been lost, though no one is sure whether this information was lost in one of the resets or by design. The Foundation has made sure that SCP-2000 will not be breached. The facility is guarded by cognito hazards that will stop anyone without the appropriate inoculation. Any unauthorized access attempts are considered grounds for instant termination, regardless of how high-ranking someone might be in the Foundation. SCP-2000 is to the Foundation what the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is to agriculture. The fail-safe in case everything goes wrong. That's why it has the object class of Thaumiel, a rare classification that is secret to all but the highest levels of the Foundation. But to almost everyone, including every SCP Foundation member who has never encountered it, SCP-2000 is just an old, rarely used park ranger station in Yellowstone National Park, with absolutely nothing unique about it, and no reason to look closer. And the Foundation will ensure it stays that way. That's why when a letter was found at the bottom of the Marianas Trench that described one of these world-resetting scenarios, a letter that pleads to not let the world that existed before be forgotten or hidden away, the Foundation made sure with absolute certainty that it would never see the light of day.
Endless. That's a word you're likely to hear thrown around a lot at the SCP Foundation, like SCP-3008, known as the Infinite IKEA, Endless. Or take the life of the tragically immortal Dr. Bright, who became one with SCP-963 and now is condemned to existing within it on some level forever. Endless. Or most pertinent of all for today's video, take SCP-087, a terrifying staircase full of tangible darkness and a frightening and unknowable entity. No matter how far down you go, it seems as though there's just another flight waiting for you. Endless. But really, is anything ever really endless? Or is endless just the word we use for something when we haven't found that sought-after end just yet? For those who travel far enough, there may be a limit to the infinite IKEA. Someday Dr. Bright's medallion one day might lay inert and lifeless, with no traces of his consciousness left. And for those who ventured down far enough, able to clench their teeth and get past the fear, you may someday find that even SCP-087 has a final flight. But what if this isn't just a hypothetical? What if this has already happened, but the truth was considered too dangerous or too horrifying to share? What's really at the bottom of SCP-087? Today we hope to find out. Let's just also hope that knowing doesn't end up being more of a burden than we'd expected. Before we head to the bottom of the endless staircase though, we must first return to SCP-087's file and refresh our memories on some of the crucial basics. After all, it's been quite some time since our last video on the subject. This Euclid-class anomaly is one of the most well-known and feared, partially thanks to classified information being leaked via a certain video game, probably coded by the Serpent's Hand. As we alluded to earlier, many know 087 as the Endless Staircase, based in an administrative building of a classified North American university campus. It's been behind a number of mysterious deaths and disappearances, and has left many of its escaping victims traumatized and in a state of permanent catatonia. Having to descend the staircase is just that terrifying. Equally infamous as the staircase itself are the 3 tests that the Foundation conducted into the staircase before deciding to just board up the door forever. In the first, a D-class that was once a member of the Foundation was forced to see just how many flights he could descend. Not long after first entering the staircase and beginning to make his way down, he heard the desperate and distressed pleas of a child. He kept descending but found he seemed to be getting no closer to the source of the distress. When he was deep enough, that's when he encountered SCP-087-1, a frightening, uncanny face with few discernible features. The sheer terror of encountering this entity was enough to send him running back to the top. The second test played out similarly, with a D-Class being sent in with a number of powerful, sticky-backed lights that he was ordered to place against the walls as he descended. This was done in hopes of increasing visibility on the staircase. However, it proved to be unsuccessful, as the darkness in 087 is more of a tangible presence than the mere absence of light. It was able to smother out visibility regardless of a light's source of power. Once again, the D-Class heard the crying and encountered the face, causing him to flee. And the third and penultimate test involved a D-Class who got really unlucky. She traversed the staircase deeper than any of her predecessors, before eventually encountering the horrifying face of SCP-087-1. However, rather than running up and away from the entity, in a state of sheer panic, the D-Class instead ran downwards, deeper and deeper into the staircase. The audio cut as the face continued in its pursuit, and the D-Class was never seen again. Did you notice that we said penultimate and not final before that last one? That's because there's actually a highly classified fourth expedition into the SCP-087 staircase, but as you can see on the original file, the data is expunged. What could have happened in that study that led the Foundation to wipe it from the records? Did they discover the great secret behind SCP-087? A secret too horrible for mortal minds to bear? We're not just going to give you one answer today. We're going to give you three. That's right. 3 different interpretations of the secret fourth expedition into SCP-087. Which is the real one? Well, you'll just have to see. After all, nothing is simple when it comes to SCP-087. Though our first potential option is the most simple of the 3. In this iteration of the experiment, a male D-Class murderer was instructed to descend the staircase into the heart of SCP-087, with the Foundation hoping to find out what happened to D-9884, the female D-Class who disappeared at the conclusion of the third expedition. In a sense, this new D-Class would discover the fate that most likely befell D-9884, but through first-hand experience rather than distant observation. Being directed by Dr. Erdio over walkie-talkie, the male D-Class slowly got deeper into the anomaly, flight by flight. Predictably, he began to hear the intensely distressed crying of a small child around 200 meters below him, and immediately felt a sense of paranoia and dread wash over his mind. Despite this, Dr. Erdio ordered him to keep going, descending deeper and deeper into the bowels of SCP-087. Over time, the sheer psychological exhaustion of SCP-087 was beginning to take its toll on the D-Class, leading him to taking a brief break in order to nap. However, he awoke with a violent start, seeing the horrific face of SCP-087-1 staring down at him. It felt like all his worst nightmares had come to life. In order to escape the monster, he began to flee further down into SCP-087. Much like D-9884 before him, it would be the last mistake he ever made. When he finally reached the very bottom of the 087 staircases, the D-Class realized he was trapped. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Suddenly, the face of SCP-087-1 was hovering over him, boring its gaze into him. As the D-Class directed his powerful flashlight at the creature, he saw that this time it was more than just a face. The entity had a whole body, 7 or 8 feet long, with that same ghostly white and death-like appearance. It reached out with huge clawed hands and grasped the D-Class. Before the audio and video feed cut out entirely, the last thing the attending researchers heard was the screaming from the hapless D-Class and the crunch of his bones within the creature's huge hands. But of course, that's just one of 3 possible insane discoveries at the very bottom of SCP-087. Let's turn our attention to the next one, and see if its answer to the SCP-087 riddle seems to satisfy all of our burning questions. Much like the previous iteration, a single male D-Class was sent into the clutches of SCP-087 in hopes of getting some answers on what happened to D-9884. Of course, he was given all the standard equipment, from a 75-watt flashlight to a defensive weapon to a healthy supply of water and nutrition bars, none of which would save him in the end. Like all the others, this D-Class descended down those accursed stairs, getting deeper and deeper. When he reached a certain point on the way down, he heard something, but not the crying of a child like all the others had reported. It was an adult woman's scream. Specifically, it was the scream of D-9884, exactly as the Foundation researchers had heard it over the audio feed in her last moments before disappearing. This was progress. The researchers instructed this male D-Class to go deeper, passing flight after flight until finally the SCP-087-1 face appeared. But again, something was different. Something was wrong. Now it looked more like the face of D-9884, just without her mouth and pupils. Had SCP-087-1 been stealing the faces of its prior victims? Had the previous face been stolen from a student who'd gone missing from the campus? These were all questions the male D-Class didn't have time to ponder, as he was too busy running for dear life. But he didn't get far. Despite having no history of such medical problems, the male D-Class suddenly experienced a seizure while attempting to escape and collapsed. The last thing his video feed picked up before losing transmission was a pair of long white arms emerging from the dark, crushing him inside of its huge hands before dragging his enfolded corpse into the darkness. That's another chilling potential account of the possible fourth expedition into SCP-087, but we can't stop now. We still have one more tale of terror to share before this video is done. In the next and final iteration, 2 D-Classes, one male and one female, were sent down together in hopes of discovering what had happened to D-9884. And by the end, they would have their answer, but they certainly wouldn't like it. As the 2 of them descended, they saw the marks on the wall where the adhesive lights from Expedition 2 had been somehow torn off. But the deeper they descended, the more disturbing the things they found became. They discovered words clawed into the stone walls, each one revealing a piece of a more frightening puzzle the deeper down SCP-087 they traversed. They descended further, sustaining minor injuries from a foul-smelling and caustic substance left on some of the walls and floors around them. At some point along the journey, a light was dropped, and in the brief seconds of darkness, the female D-Class disappeared. The male D-Class was ordered to go deeper and deeper into the staircase until he finally began to hear the crying of a little girl. When he reached the 666th floor, he found a wooden door with the word home scratched into it. He steeled himself and entered the room, but it wasn't a room at all. It was a field, shrouded in darkness with a distant tree. A little girl, the one who had been crying, was finally actually here. She told the D-Class that she'd always been here, and that her father had been trying to find her a body so she could go upstairs. But for that to happen, she'd have to be properly birthed first. That's when the male D-Class noticed the 2 huge stone slabs just beyond the darkness. On one was the corpse of D-9884, hanged by her wrists with thick metal chains. Her abdomen had been fully cut open, as though a brutal C-section had been performed on her. And on the other stone was the female D-Class who'd been accompanying him this whole time, strung up but still very much alive, seemingly the next potential vessel for the little girl's rebirth. But this didn't mean that the male D-Class would be left out of the fun either. After all, the little girl's father would need a new body too, if he wanted to accompany his daughter upstairs. The father in question being SCP-087-1, which appeared in the room moments later and swooped in towards the male D-Class. What followed was a battery of nightmarish sounds as the darkness expanded and consumed the field once more. Not long after this, the Foundation sealed off the entrance to SCP-087 forever, now knowing that it potentially contained multiple hostile entities intent on escaping into our world and causing further damage. Students in the area reported a number of frantic knocks coming from the door for a brief period after that, until the Foundation finally had it properly soundproofed, and the issues were seemingly over with, for now. So there you have it, 3 potential terrifying secrets at the bottom of SCP-087. Which do you think is the most likely? Let us know down in the comments. After all, when it comes to SCP-087, it seems you can always delve just a little bit deeper.
Welcome back, comrade. The case of SCP-2273, also known as Major Alexei Belitrov, has sparked your imagination, and you need to know more. But even if you're not familiar with the Major, his story, all you need to know is that it's one of war, tragedy, and alternate dimensions. He first appeared in the town of Danner, Wisconsin on the 13th of October 1989 during an unprecedented seismic event. When he was first discovered, the Foundation researchers assumed that he was an extraterrestrial being on account of his advanced organic exoskeleton. In a surprising move for such an imposing creature, Belitrov gave himself up to Foundation agents without a fight. Major Belitrov was then impounded in Foundation Containment Site-17, where he was interrogated thoroughly. Over a series of interviews, the Foundation ascertained that Belitrov came from an alternate timeline where Russia and the US are locked in a so-called war to end the world, thanks to advanced military technology given to them by SCP-1000. Belitrov had narrowly escaped execution at the hands of American soldiers and appeared in our timeline. Now he is a prisoner of the advanced suit that formerly kept him alive. But his story isn't over. The last remnant of a Cold War turned hot has plenty left to teach us. Something that you need to understand about the SCP Foundation before we go any further is that it doesn't only exist in every nation across the globe. It also exists in every splinter reality across the multiverse. And these splinter realities offer a countless multitude of tales of different places, different people, and different times. Today's tale concerns Major Belitrov's future in a universe where the secrecy of the Foundation is broken, and the anomalous world needs to find a way to fit in with our own. The year was 2018. Like many humanoid anomalies that the Foundation was holding in this timeline, Belitrov was released from containment. He was no longer an SCP. He was now a mere person of interest, free to move around as he pleased. But this didn't mean Belitrov was about to enjoy a quiet life on Easy Street. He was still an interdimensional refugee from a broken alternate world. Thankfully, there was a certain group willing to help. The Mana Charitable Foundation. This anomalous charity has been involved in a number of strange cases investigated by the Foundation before, and now they were going to lend a hand to Major Belitrov. Thanks to their anomaly reintegration project, Mana was able to transport Belitrov back to his home of Volgograd in Russia. There, he became something of a national celebrity, making headlines across the country, sitting down for interviews on every Russian talk show, and even being offered book deals. But as a former military man, Belitrov was eager to return to government life and run for a government position. However, this ambition didn't go very far. Belitrov was rejected by all the government bodies he applied to. Even Vladimir Putin wasn't eccentric enough to want an insectoid cyborg from another dimension in his cabinet. Belitrov endured a rough 2 years in Volgograd. He was treated more like a sideshow freak than a human being. People didn't want to rent apartments to him, and he was never able to find permanent employment. Even entry-level jobs rejected him. Nobody wanted to get food served to them by what looked to be a 7-foot monster, and he seemed equally ill-suited to help Russian women find the right perfume in department stores. In April of 2020, Belitrov had finally had enough. He contacted the Mana Charitable Foundation once again and asked to be relocated. They told him that some religious institutions in the area, including the Eastern Clockwork Orthodox Church, were accepting and housing anomalous refugees. Not long after this, Belitrov truly fell off of the SCP Foundation's radar. But one former Foundation operative was well aware of Major Belitrov's fate. It's 2021. Dr. Friedrich, the Site-17 anomaly psychologist who'd conducted all the initial interviews with Belitrov all the way back in 1989, started receiving letters from him. There was no indication as to his true location, and they appeared to have been handled by a Mana Charitable Foundation mail carrier in Russia. But Dr. Friedrich was happy to hear from an old friend nonetheless. Due to a career of working near highly radioactive anomalies like Belitrov, Dr. Friedrich was suffering from terminal lymphoma. It seemed almost like an act of divine providence that Belitrov's letters would come to him so close to the end. The two began a correspondence, and it was only after Dr. Friedrich's eventual death that the letters came to the SCP Foundation's attention. It was from this final correspondence that the Foundation was able to answer the big question: whatever happened to Major Alexei Belitrov? In his first letter to Dr. Friedrich, Belitrov thanked him profusely. He knew that Dr. Friedrich had been a crucial part of him gaining freedom from the Foundation, and credited the therapeutic techniques taught to him by Dr. Friedrich with keeping him alive and sane to this day. Belitrov expressed a mix of amazement at this brave new world and a sense of profound weariness. As a man eternally locked into a weapon of war, he felt unsuited to a world in peacetime. He almost missed the scorched, irradiated Russia of his home dimension. But most of all, he missed Site-17. He missed Dr. Friedrich. He missed some of his fellow anomalies like SCP-049, the Teleporting Man, and SCP-163, the Spacecraft. He even missed the simplicity of being contained. He hoped that Dr. Friedrich would write back. In his second letter, Belitrov began detailing his experience with the Eastern Clockwork Orthodox Church. Despite growing up in a highly atheistic communist environment, Belitrov became enamored with the ways of the church. He found them to be highly accepting of him in spite of his unfortunate circumstances. They displayed a freedom in their faith that Belitrov had never encountered before, and he was eager to be a part of it. With the help of Dr. Friedrich, Belitrov was also sending letters to some of his fellow freed anomalies. He signed off by saying that he had even started praying, something he'd never considered before. The next letter, sent in 2027, struck a much more somber tone. It was sent shortly after Belitrov discovered Dr. Friedrich's diagnosis. He wanted to return and see the doctor one more time, but the Mana Charitable Foundation wouldn't allow him to return to Site-17. Believing he had been abused during his time there, Belitrov gave Frederick his prayers and well wishes, and asked for a number through which he could contact his ailing old friend. By the time the next letter arrived in 2034, Belitrov had become a fully fledged member of the Eastern Clockwork Orthodox Church. He referred to the other monks at the monastery as his brothers and sisters. He seemed to have finally found a true home there, and the others fondly referred to him by the nickname Father Anvil. But the true heart of the letter is Belitrov's deep concern for Dr. Friedrich's health. Notably in this letter, he often refers to Dr. Friedrich by his first name, Thomas, as though to emphasize the urgency of the message. After the deaths of several of the anomalies that Belitrov considered friends, he stated that he couldn't handle losing anyone else. His letter ends with a poignant passage. "You may be unmarried, Dr. Friedrich, but you are not unloved. You have to be strong for me. You have to be strong for yourself. If you're ever worried that you cannot find the strength to continue, think of the garden you'll plant this spring. I'd like to share gardening photos with you again. Not many of my brothers and sisters here appreciate the simple beauty of a flower bed, or the effort that goes into growing a patch of vegetables. It's a beauty I'd like to continue to share. Trust in the power of our Lord, Thomas, and trust in the power of modern medicine. God is smiling on you. Please, be strong. With love and prayers, Alexei Belitrov." This letter arrived on the 15th of February, 2034. Sadly, Dr. Friedrich had already passed away 4 days earlier. He never got to see Alexei's final letter, and it truly was his final letter. With nobody left for him in the world, Major Belitrov stopped sending any correspondence. What we know about the final years of Belitrov's life all comes from a few scattered journal entries, translated from Russian after his passing. They provide clues as to the kind of life he lived during the 29 years the Foundation could not account for his whereabouts and his actions. The first entry, written on January 7th, 2035, paints a grim picture of Belitrov feeling broken and isolated in the monastery. He wrote, "Today is the day that our monastery celebrates the birth of our Lord. However, I feel no desire to celebrate. All of my friends in this world are dead. My brothers and sisters are partaking in some celebration outside my dormitory. All of the required ceremonies are complete. Neither they nor whatever is happening out there will lighten my mood." Belitrov also wrote about losing the comfort he once had in his faith, and his doubts about whether he would be able to recapture that comfort. But he had survived greater traumas than this, and he would continue to press on. As the months turned to years and the years turned to decades, Belitrov climbed through the ranks of the monastery. seeing as the Eastern Clockwork Orthodox Church practically worshiped the concepts of industrialization and mechanization. The fact that Belitrov was permanently encased in a biomechanical exoskeleton probably made him seem even more pious to his holy brethren. The final piece of evidence collected by the Foundation into the life and times of Alexei Belitrov came just over 20 years later, in a final address written to comfort his followers in preparation for his own death. Belitrov recounted the details of his own life, being born into a world of fire, death, and mushroom clouds. Then his life being suddenly saved by forces beyond his control, only to place him into containment for almost 30 years. It was only after accepting the teachings of the Church and accepting the Clockwork Goddess that he felt he was truly free from his past. In this final note, Belitrov lay out some of the teachings of his new religion, the belief in a great mechanized goddess who planned all of reality. According to Belitrov, everything in her design fits together perfectly, like cogs in a machine, turning and twisting in unison to create an ideal world. He hoped to be forgiven for the many violent sins he committed in his military life, and that his contributions to this new world were valuable. At the very end of his address, Belitrov wrote, "I do not believe that my time in this world is much longer. Brothers and sisters, when my time of judgment comes, do not mourn me. I would rather you remember these words. The goddess is most pleased with those who seek kind, non-violent resolution to their problems, because a machine whose gears grind against each other is a machine that cannot work. See truth, but also compassion. The words are only words. Seek out truth within them. God bless you all. Father Anvil." A month after authoring this statement, records indicate that Alexei Belitrov was found dead in his room, having passed away peacefully in his sleep from natural causes. He lived a warrior's life, but died a humble priest's death. The true tragedy in the strange life of Major Alexei Belitrov is how little choice he had in his circumstances. But thanks to this tale, we know he did what he could with the life he was given. His remains lay within the graveyard at the Eastern Clockwork Orthodoxy Monastery, where he spent the last years of his life. With a life as difficult as his own, we can only imagine he's glad to finally rest. If you've been a close follower of this channel for a while now, or even of the SCP Foundation archive as a whole, then there's a pretty high chance that you might have heard of SCP-096. Even if this just so happens to be the first of our SCP videos that you've ever clicked on, you still might have seen the Shy Guy itself in various other corners of the internet. Since the earliest days of the SCP Foundation, SCP-096 has gradually become one of the most iconic and recognizable creatures in the Foundation's entire menagerie of anomalous beings. Despite standing taller than any ordinary person, you might be forgiven for mistaking SCP-096 for a human being if you were to see it at a distance, but the creature is unusually proportioned, to say the least, still appearing almost human in its shape, but possessing long, dangling arms that almost reach the ground. SCP-096's body is thin and hairless, with opaque, clear white pupilless eyes and a wide, gaping mouth. Or so we've heard, thanks to drawings provided by someone who sadly isn't with us anymore. But you might be surprised to learn that SCP-096 doesn't really do all that much. Mostly the tall, spindly humanoid spends its days walking mindlessly, pacing around in its containment cell. Sounds like most days in a college dorm during lockdown, right? That is, of course, until someone dares to look at SCP-096's face. It doesn't have to be directly either. It can be something as simple as glancing at a photo or watching a video of the creature. But the moment it is seen, the exact second it is perceived, the wiry monster will know. Having its face viewed in any way will cause the Shy Guy to really live up to its nickname. The creature suffers some sort of psychological meltdown, covering its face with its huge claw-like hands and weeping. SCP-096 quickly becomes utterly inconsolable, suffering from extreme emotional distress until it simply can't take it anymore. Pulling itself up to its full looming height, SCP-096 will stand and travel at impossible speeds towards the person that dared look at its face. There's no way to hide from the Shy Guy. Nothing can stand in its path as it tracks down this unlucky person. And when it finds them, well, it's certainly not pleasant.
Somehow, without leaving any trace on their body, SCP-096 will kill the person that looked at it, possibly even eating them afterwards. Then it calms itself down, returns to its more docile state, and is typically bagged and brought back home by whatever mobile task force is closest. SCP-096 has killed many of the teams sent to contain it, proving itself to be resistant to gunfire and any forms of conventional weaponry. As much as being only a tiny speck in a photograph, that is enough to trigger the creature's relentless defense mechanism. Nobody can get away from it either. There is literally nowhere in the entire world that someone can run to escape SCP-096. Not even crossing the oceans or jumping aboard a plane is enough to stop it. And if our community questions video on the matter is anything to go by, you may not even be safe in outer space. The SCP Foundation's only real way to keep the creature safely under wraps and contained is to lock it up and force all members of personnel to never, ever look at it, while they hunt down any pieces of recorded media still out there, waiting like a ticking time bomb. So if no member of the Foundation can look at SCP-096, how do they interact with it? Well, luckily, there's a tale that answers exactly that, known as A Lesson in Power. Dr. Danielle Kowalski, a member of the Foundation's research team assigned to SCP-096, was sent into the creature's cell wearing a sleep mask. You know, the kind you get on expensive flights. What she was really wishing for, though, was a gas mask to go with it. Nobody had warned her how bad SCP-096 smelled. Then again, few had been as close to the creature as she had and lived to tell the tale. As a child, Danielle Kowalski had a fear of stepping into the ocean. Her mother used to warn her about treading on a stingray and dying as a result, giving her a phobia that stayed with her for many years. But Danielle's father had encouraged her to face her fear, to shuffle her feet on the ocean floor, kicking up sand so that the stingray would know she was coming, and would simply just swim away. Perhaps if he could have seen what kind of horrors Danielle was working with at the Foundation, her father wouldn't have tried to make her so fearless. Maybe there are some things that it's logical to be afraid of. Entering SCP-096's cell, Dr. Kowalski could hear the monster's heaving breaths, the perfect mix between a frightened whimper and a death rattle, the haunting sound of a person's final gasp of air. In the back of her mind, Danielle hoped she didn't touch the creature by accident. The closer she got, the tension and the heat of its warm breath against her skin was making the approach all the more terrifying. She had been issued with an instant camera and took a photo in the dark. Click. The flash fired, but with her eyes covered, she couldn't tell. That was good though. That was the point. If Danielle could see the flash going off, she could see what else was in the room, and that would put her in even more danger. She was locked in with a kind of stingray that wouldn't swim away, even if it knew she was there. Slowly, Dr. Kowalski began blindly photographing the cell around her, stuffing each freshly printed photo into her pocket as the camera spat them out. Over the span of 45 minutes, she took a series of pictures of the entire cell until the film in the instant camera had run out. Danielle knew that she would probably only need one picture, but better to have more just in case. Luckily, none of her Foundation colleagues were around to tell her how insane what she was doing actually was. They were all preoccupied, preparing the site for its first official visit from the FBI. This all took place after what was known as the Broken Masquerade had taken place. Essentially, knowledge of the SCP Foundation and its research into the endless stream of anomalies it had contained was all made public. People knew the truth now, and the Foundation found itself in the one place it never wanted to be, the public eye. The organization and its activities were under the scrutiny of every journalist on the planet, and once more information about the SCPs and the anomalous world of the Foundation became known, the world would surely change forever. Danielle Kowalski knew all of this and told herself that everyone would need something for protection now. She only hoped her photographs would be enough. 15 months later, Dr. Kowalski was interrogated in her apartment by one Agent O'Brien. He and a group of fellow agents had barged into Danielle's home, demanding to know the location where a number of SCP-610 specimens were being held. SCP-610 being, of course, the infamous infection known as the flesh that hates, a disease capable of turning human beings into horrible, deformed monstrosities of flesh. Agent O'Brien, and presumably whoever he was working for, was intent on turning these creatures into weapons. and the man had little patience for a former Foundation researcher who wasn't giving up the answers that he wanted. Danielle tried to argue with the agent, citing the Berlin Accords against weaponized anomalies, a motion proposed to the United States Senate that would forbid the use of anomalous objects, entities, and creatures as weapons for any country. O'Brien wasn't interested. He claimed that if the Kremlin and Russia had no intention of ratifying such a law, then America wouldn't either. The agent had his men grab Danielle by her arm, while he grabbed her right middle finger and began to push a thin knife under her fingernail. The former member of the Foundation tried to stifle her scream, but couldn't stop herself as the pain struck. As Agent O'Brien tortured Danielle, he told her that the Russians had all the information they would need about SCP-610 in order to turn the flesh into some kind of weapon. As far as he was concerned, the United States government needed access to those SCP-610 specimens to know exactly what they would be up against in the likely event that Russia used the flesh that hates against them. And only a researcher for the SCP Foundation, the former senior researcher on the SCP-610 project, would know where to find those specimens.
You don't think it's reasonable for the United States government to want to understand what could be used against us?
O'Brien asked as Danielle's blood trickled out of her finger into his leather gloves.
Hell, I don't care what you think we're gonna do with it. I want those specimens.
When the agent finally let her go, Dr. Kowalski tried to catch her breath, forcing herself not to scream in pain again. She pointed with her other unharmed hand to her bedroom, telling O'Brien to check the bottom left drawer. She had placed a manila envelope in there, containing the only thing Danielle had kept since departing the SCP Foundation. Under O'Brien's orders, his men ransacked the nearby room and were quickly able to find what they were looking for. The envelope was presented to Agent O'Brien, who was no doubt expecting to find a file inside, something that detailed the exact location of those specimens he was looking for. So you can probably imagine the dissatisfied look on his face when he opened the envelope to find photographs. A collection of instant photos, all taken in a dark cell, with all of them depicting a tall, thin, humanoid creature. A being with long, dangling arms that almost reached the ground, a thin, hairless body, opaque, pupilless eyes, and a wide, gaping mouth. Furious to once again be denied the information he was looking for, O'Brien disregarded the pictures and burned Dr. Kowalski's neck with his cigarette. In his anger, he said,
I think your Foundation sure thought they were powerful hiding in the shadows, but I'd like to explain to you why you're wrong.
The agent then went on to describe his time as a member of the DEA in the late 1980s, and how he'd been involved in the hunting of notorious cartel boss Pablo Escobar.
I had a narco in custody, every bit as uncooperative as you are now.
The man had insisted that Escobar owned all of the Colombian law enforcement, but a younger O'Brien had argued that if that was the case, and they possessed all this power, then why did Pablo Escobar's men hide their guns? Why smuggle drugs in secret and bury their money where no one would find it if they really had the control they claimed? Much like Escobar's cartel, the SCP Foundation had always moved in the shadows, a power that O'Brien believed to have really belonged to the government.
Your anomalies belong to us. Your research belongs to us. Your life belongs to us,
he told Dr. Kowalski. Suddenly, one of the other agents noticed movement outside of the apartment. The second that Danielle saw a long arm phase through her wall, with gray skin like that of a corpse, she snapped her eyes shut. O'Brien and his men drew all their guns and opened fire on the monster that had walked through the wall as if it wasn't even there. All the while, Danielle Kowalski kept her eyes shut. The sounds of screaming and snapping bones and a sickening slurping noise filled the air, but she made sure not to look. Within a few quick moments of panic and agonizing pain, it was over. The apartment was quiet, apart from strange breathing, like a mix of a frightening whimper and a death rattle.
Run along now, 096,
Dr. Kowalski told the shy guy.
There are worse monsters in this world than you.
Some anomalies kill for fun, others for food, others because they simply have no choice. On the other side of the coin, some want nothing more than to spread love, joy, and happiness. But it's rare that you see an anomaly that has genuinely pure intentions, but whose attempts to do good often turn deadly. One such figure, and the subject of today's tale, is SCP-049, the Plague Doctor. If you're at all familiar with the SCP Foundation, then you will have likely heard of the infamous Plague Doctor. For those of you who haven't, here's a bit of context for SCP-049. He appears exactly as you'd expect a plague doctor from the late medieval period or Renaissance periods. A tall figure shrouded in long black robes. A hood over his head with only a Venetian-beaked mask protruding from underneath. These aren't just a fashion statement either. The SCP Foundation discovered that these are all part of SCP-049's physical body, sharing a similar structure to muscle and bone. The Plague Doctor's primary goal is to find those he considers to be infected with something he refers to as the Pestilence. If he ever senses this affliction, he will attempt to make direct skin contact with the person carrying it. Why? Because SCP-049's touch is lethal, killing anyone he comes into contact with. You might think that's all the Plague Doctor does, goes from person to person killing them with his deadly touch, but you would be wrong. Once he's killed a victim, SCP-049 then begins performing a crude, outdated form of surgery on their corpse. Using equipment he produces from his mysterious and apparently bottomless magical medical satchel, he injects a number of unknown chemicals into the corpse, which brings them back to life and turns them into an instance of SCP-049-2, or in other words, a vicious, mindless zombie. At present, SCP-049 is kept secure in a holding cell by the Foundation under watch by surveillance cameras for 24 hours a day. And that is where our story begins. The tale of a deadly, dangerous doctor and his days spent in captivity. Locked away in a cage, contained by the SCP Foundation, there he sits, alone. It is a tale known only by the simple title, Going Home. It begins with the Plague Doctor, left alone in his cell. He had been there for such a long time that he'd forgotten exactly how long. But there he sat, taunted by the sensation of pestilence around him. It was a small, almost undetectable feeling, but it reeked of decay and disease, hanging in the very air particles of SCP-049's cell. Although they had long since stopped the practice, the SCP Foundation used to send its doctors and researchers into 049's cell, bringing him cadavers as test subjects. The Plague Doctor would use these specimens to hone his craft, perfecting his method of transforming the dead into instances of SCP-049-2. But of course, the doctors working for the Foundation weren't exactly free of disease themselves, and they too often needed to be cured by his touch. And soon they stopped visiting SCP-049 in person, leaving him alone in his cell. Even these so-called people of science feared the true cure, it seemed. They would talk to the Plague Doctor via an intercom system, interviewing him and asking questions about what he did or how he felt. One question stood out to SCP-049. The Foundation researchers had asked him if he had any regrets for what he had done to people. The Plague Doctor thought it foolish to even ask. And then even the questions coming through the intercom stopped after a while. For a time, SCP-049 was happy in his cell, left alone with his thoughts, safe from the diseases of the outside world. The Plague Doctor was at peace for a change, resting in comfort, until the familiar smell of pestilence returned. The presence of disease drove him to attempt an escape. Producing his medical implements from his bag he kept concealed in his robes, SCP-049 tried to pry open the door to his cell. He wasn't sure how long it took. The passage of time had long since stopped registering to him, but eventually he had it open, just enough so that he could pass through, out into the corridor beyond the chamber that he had been held in. There was no one else around, no doctors or researchers or Foundation security personnel. No one to stop the Plague Doctor from following the stench of the disease that had driven him to find a way out of containment. Navigating through the hallways of the Foundation facility, SCP-049 tracked the source of the disease to a locker. With little trouble, he opened it, finding a metallic box within. As he studied the container, his fingers found the button that opened it. It hissed as the gases kept the inside of the box mixed with the air. The cold vapor hit the Plague Doctor in the face, catching him by surprise and making him drop the box. Reasserting himself, the Plague Doctor bent over and picked up the contents of the refrigerated container, a single mosquito. It wasn't the insect itself that had drawn SCP-049 out of his cell. True, mosquitoes are known to spread diseases like malaria, but it was what was inside this mosquito that the doctor wanted to eradicate. Its blood sac was full, swollen with dark fluid that SCP-049 knew to be infected. Using the metal box as an improvised operating table, he produced his bag of medical implements, and the doctor began to operate. He retrieved a syringe from his bag and a vial filled with thick black liquid. Half filling the syringe with the liquid, he plunged the needle into the mosquito and extracted the blood that the insect was carrying. The infected bodily fluid mixed with the medicine in the doctor's syringe, leaving the bug as little more than a dry husk. The plague doctor watched as the two substances mixed together before stabbing back into the mosquito, filling the creature with a combination of both liquids. He refused to leave any trace of pestilence in the insect's body. The mosquito twitched itself back to life, looking around until it saw SCP-049 observing it.
"Who's there?"
it asked.
"Where's Merle?"
"There is no one here but me and you," the doctor explained. "You are in a prison though. The wardens, it seems, have left."
"A prison?"
the insect responded.
"Oh God, I'm at Site 19!
Naturally, it seemed rather strange for a mosquito to be able to talk, let alone know about the highly classified Site 19. But as is always the case in the SCP Foundation, the strange always has an anomalous explanation. You see, this mosquito was not like any other. For one, she even had a name. It was Leslie. As it turned out, Leslie was part of an SCP, one of the Foundation's own creation, SCP-3774. These were a genetically and cybernetically enhanced species of mosquito. Why would the Foundation spend time and resources creating something like this? Originally, they were designed as an undetectable, covert way of keeping tabs on persons of interest to the SCP Foundation. The Plague Doctor thought it odd that after having spent so much time imprisoned there, that he should finally learn the name of Site 19 from a mosquito of all things. Leslie seemed to be in a state of panic, however urgently insisting that she had to get back to someone named Merle. SCP-049 had no clue what she meant. He'd never encountered anyone that went by that name, and had no idea where to even begin looking.
"I know where he lives. I can find it," the mosquito insisted. I don't know how I could ever get out of here."
She was wary of the creature she found herself talking to. Despite being a genetically engineered insect, Leslie was, for all intents and purposes, an agent of the SCP Foundation, and now she was currently conversing with an anomaly that she knew nothing about. But he wasn't trying to harm her. In fact, whatever the Plague Doctor had done seemed to have revived her. "I have gotten myself this far, and now that I have no further reason to stay here," the doctor announced, holding a hand out for Leslie to fly up to.
Then you'll help me get out of here?"
she asked, readying her wings and landing in his palm. "I will," SCP-049 agreed. The pair introduced themselves properly, Leslie giving SCP-049 her name while he just instructed her to call him Doctor before they set out together. After almost a week of traveling on foot through rugged terrain and harsh winds, the Plague Doctor and his insect companion had yet to encounter another living soul. Thick dark clouds hung in the sky above them, and Leslie soon found it hard to remember what the sun looked like. She feared that she might even forget Merle's face.
"We're close," she said. "Just a few more miles and then..."
"And then we will arrive," SCP-049 finished her sentence.
"Tell me, Doctor, why did you come all this way with me?"
Leslie the mosquito asked.
"You could have left when we got out, gone on your own way."
In response, he gave one simple sentence: "Merely because I wanted to." Finally, the intrepid pair arrived at a house once belonging to Merle. It was abandoned, ramshackle, in a total state of disrepair. Decades had passed since anyone had set foot in the place. The living room that had once been so familiar to Leslie had now been transformed into a barren, empty space. The sight of it made her so distraught with sadness that she would have been sick, if mosquitoes could be sick. Merle, whoever he was or had been, was now nowhere to be found. One of Leslie's cybernetic enhancements was an internal positioning system, giving her all sorts of data and readouts, including a clock. It told her just how long she'd been away for.
"I've been dead for 200 years?"
the mosquito cried in the palm of the doctor's hand.
Then Merle is dead. Everyone is dead."
She kept repeating it to herself over and over, as if she was trying to convince herself of what had happened. Eventually, the words lost all meaning. As he held Leslie in his hands, perhaps the Plague Doctor felt sorry for the mosquito. After all, the Plague Doctor had always had a respectful, polite personality despite his frightening exterior. He had always believed that he'd acted in service of the greater good, trying to cure the world of pestilence, to bring the end of disease. He only ever killed because, to him, it was in his victim's best interest for him to perform his procedures. To his captors at the SCP Foundation, the Doctor had been courteous and cooperative, and he acted the same towards his fellow SCPs. Not just Leslie, but even the sort of anomalies with nothing but hatred in their hearts. The Doctor saw them as just further victims of the pestilence, in need of curing. SCP-049 sat in silence for a while with his mosquito friend, letting her mourn the loss of Merle and everything she had ever known. "Where will you go now?" he asked. Still in tears, barely able to speak through her sobs, Leslie decided that she wanted to stay where she was. The insect wanted to live where Merle had lived, in a desperate attempt to recapture the world that she once knew. Sitting in the Plague Doctor's gloved hands, still sobbing even though she had run out of tears, Leslie said, Any minute Merle will come through the door." The Plague Doctor held his tiny companion where she was, while she grieved. "Then I will wait for him," he told her. "Here, with you." It writhes against the snow, red, raw, and vicious. Too many mouths, too many limbs, twitching and dripping. Once it looked a lot like you, but now it's something different entirely. If ever it escapes its bounds, it'll rebuild the whole world in its image. It is known and feared by everyone with sufficient clearance at the SCP Foundation. And for good reason. It'll infect anyone and anything, and a death sentence is preferable to infection. It is a disease that thinks, the crawling corruption, the flesh that hates. Or if you fear its true name too much to speak it and find comfort in the categorization and clinical eyes of the SCP Foundation, SCP-610. SCP-610 is a contagious skin disease transmitted by direct contact. Anyone infected with it suffers a horrific mutation, turning them into fleshy, inhuman monstrosities. These infected creatures will attack and infect anyone nearby that isn't also carrying SCP-610. This also happens to be the flesh described and adored by those following the twisted religion of Sarkicism, a violent cult and group of interests that worships flesh, corruption, and disease. And as the Foundation operatives tasked with observing groups of interests know, Sarkicism is a sect that directly opposes the machine-revering Church of the Broken God. And to understand the events of the tale known to the SCP Foundation as Aftermath, the beginning that leads to its brutal and world-changing end, one must first understand the endless conflict between these two groups. The Church of the Broken God is a religion that the SCP Foundation has had a number of encounters with over the years. Members of the Church share in the belief that biological, flesh-based life is an inherently wrong and evil abomination. They worship mechanization, the process of making organic bodies something more mechanical in nature. According to the beliefs of the Church, two gods, Yaldabaoth and Mechane, created humanity together. Yaldabaoth was the god of flesh and animal instinct, granting humans bodies. Meanwhile, the god of machine and intellect, Mechane, blessed man with the power of free thought. As humankind developed machines, Yaldabaoth became enraged that they were ignorant of the instincts she had given them, and endeavored to destroy the creations of man. As the Church's legend goes, Mechane acted as humanity's savior, and tried desperately to stop Yaldabaoth. The god of machines shattered himself, transforming his body into a number of pieces to form a cage for his fellow god. Fragments of Mechane rained down on planet Earth. Now the Church of the Broken God believes it is their duty to recover these missing parts. There could potentially be hundreds of pieces needed to rebuild Mechane, and a number of these happen to be cataloged SCPs that the Foundation is either aware of or has in containment. Our story begins not with the long-awaited return of Mechane the Broken God. Instead, it begins with a man, a Foundation foot soldier named Roderick Freeman. This is the story of Aftermath. In 2003, at the age of 17, Roderick's ambition was to join the US Navy and become a member of the renowned Navy SEALs. After enlisting and completing 3 years of rigorous training, he achieved his ambition, only to climb even further to heights he never could have foreseen. In 2017, Roderick, now a SEAL, was recruited by the SCP Foundation after his skills and aptitude caught the attention of their embedded recruiters. He joined one of the Foundation's MTFs, or Mobile Task Forces, elite units that are often sent in to directly deal with anomalous threats. Specifically, Freeman became a member of MTF Nu 7, also known by the codename Hammer Down, the task force you call in when literally nothing else can do the job. To bring Hammer Down onto the scene for anything less than a potential XK is like swatting a housefly with a nuclear warhead. So Roderick, a gun-ho soldier boy if there ever was one, would fit right in. But what does this mobile task force have to do with all that talk about the Church of the Broken God and the flesh that hates? Well, after an incident that broke out in the Irkutsk area in Russia, they were the ones responsible for cleaning up the mess left behind. According to Roderick's account, a robot the size of a small building was spotted in this area during December 2018. This 30-foot-tall robot had apparently come to wipe out a rapidly spreading disease. As you can probably guess, that disease was SCP-049, the flesh that hates. At first, the Global Occult Coalition had fired on the robot, launching a volley of ballistic missiles in an attempt to take it down. This move failed, the robot protecting itself so that not even a piece of shrapnel could hit it. It barely seemed fazed by the attack and went about destroying remnants of SCP-010 as it found them. Any infected with the flesh were obliterated, and when its job was done, the robot simply left. Perhaps this wasn't quite the grandiose return for Mechane that the Church of the Broken God had envisioned for their deity, but it was nevertheless the long-awaited return they got. What had happened was that the SCP Foundation called a lifted veil scenario. The truth was now out. The world would soon be aware of the existence of anomalies. Afterwards, Freeman and the rest of Hammer Down recovered a series of tablets that had been left behind by Mechane. Each of them bore a simple, repeated phrase in a variety of language. Just the words, "I will return." A short time later, riots began to spark across the world. It was a disaster too big for even the Foundation to cover up. According to Roderick, multiple anomalous groups such as the Serpent's Hand and the Chaos Insurgency had gone public. In Mexico, the insurgency became involved in illegal businesses that gave the cartels an anomalous run for their ill-gotten money, while members of the Serpent's Hand used the air of tension to incite riots. In short, everything was a mess. And this eventually escalated to a full-scale civil war in Mexico in 2021. During the build-up to this, around 2019, there was unrest around the world, and mobile task forces like Hammer Down were being deployed to train alongside various public safety organizations, all in the hopes of getting the world prepared for the storm gathering all around them. The insurgency and the Hand had revealed the truth about anomalies to the world, and so the Foundation's MTFs were aiding law enforcement, special forces, and the like, readying them to defend against the anomalous. In 2022, the Foundation finally decided to intervene in the situation down in Mexico, where the Chaos Insurgency and the Serpent's Hand had been causing disruption. Roderick Freeman was one of those sent to Juarez, coming face to face with former cartel members turned lackeys for the insurgency. The Chaos Insurgency had been fighting with the Foundation for decades and knew all their tactics. Combine that with the ferocity and brutality of a lifelong cartel member, and even the toughest soldier is in for a fight. As it turns out, the fight wasn't even the worst part for our dedicated little soldier. While attempting to transport a person of interest across the Texas-Mexico border, Roderick and his squad were ambushed by a sniper. During the attack, Freeman received a wound to his spine that left him paralyzed from the hip down. However, even though the Foundation didn't like to admit it, the Church of the Broken God was actually highly skilled in surgery. After all, they worshipped mechanization and would often augment themselves using technology. Or, to use Roderick's own words, if you wanted an iPhone in your skull in 2009, they could have pulled it off. If you wanted to be able to turn the lights on and off in your home by blinking, they had an upgrade for that.
If you lost the use of your legs because of a sniper on a rooftop in Juarez, they had you covered. Thanks to members of the church, there had been a new technological revolution since the lifting of the veil. By 2024, devices that felt like they were 20 years more advanced than technology should have been were now commonly available. So that's how Roderick Freeman was able to walk again. However, the SCP Foundation refused to let him return to duty, forcing him into an administrative role. Frustrated, he applied for a job as a containment specialist. Meanwhile, the state of the world was constantly changing, with the SCP Foundation handing over safe anomalies to world governments. New divisions and departments were being formed to deal with the containment of SCPs. There was even an anomaly registration program that allowed people to call 911 to report dangerous or life-threatening anomalies. Anyone exhibiting anomalous abilities could now find doctors or therapists rather than being carted off to a containment cell. In short, the Foundation's days were numbered. However, this was not as idyllic as it sounds. According to Roderick, this should have been a chance for the civil rights of anomalous people to be respected, something that the Serpent's Hand had been campaigning for since their modern inception. Instead, it meant that anyone with anomalous traits perceived to be dangerous was arrested as threats to national security. Things were nowhere near as restrictive as under the Foundation. The safer anomalies could even have visits from family. But there was one boy, Thomas, whom Roderick had to look after, remarking that he wasn't old enough to be kept in a containment setting. Little did Roderick know, the tests that were being run on Thomas were keeping tabs on him. Somehow, the boy was able to use anomalous abilities to watch where Roderick was at all times. The SCP Foundation was finally disbanded in 2027, with the containment of anomalies becoming the responsibility of the Global Coalition Council. This organization had long been the official sanctioned counterpart to the more off-the-books Foundation, despite their more violent methods. But now the GOC was making their work known to the public. But with the Foundation gone, Roderick was out of work, picking up odd jobs over the next 6 years. There was widespread criticism of the SCP Foundation and its dubious methods, the dark things they'd done to keep anomalies contained. Civilians killed, entire populations given memory-wiping drugs to forget about SCPs, the horrific treatment of D-Class personnel. A document containing details about these practices and more was leaked, causing an outcry. The SCP Foundation's brutal methods were declared to be crimes against humanity. Alongside this, paranoia about anomalies was spreading. Governments were encouraging their citizens to report paranormal happenings, and people with anomalous traits were being registered and arrested. In Roderick's account, he says, "When people don't understand something, one of two things will happen. They will try to understand it so they can use it for their own ends, or, and this is far more likely, they will grow afraid of it and try to destroy it." So it was when humanity rediscovered anomalies, former Foundation employees were declared public enemy number 1, with anomalous persons a close second. When former members of the Foundation began to find themselves on trial by the United Nations, the public began executing any ex-Foundation personnel they could find. At first, local police or even the National Guard would intervene, but some eventually started actively helping the vigilante mobs. There was nowhere for Roderick to hide. The FBI even used the Unusual Incidents Unit to track down the Foundation's remaining members. Some had even been hired by the UIU to bring in their former co-workers. And for anyone who knows how utterly useless the Unusual Incidents Unit are, to be brought in for execution by them is a truly humiliating death. Unsure who to trust, Roderick turned to Agent Leonard Wells, a man whose life he had once saved. Meeting at a diner in Wisconsin, Leonard agreed to smuggle Roderick to Russia for $5,000, getting him safely out of the FBI's jurisdiction. Freeman agreed, and was then led to an SUV with 3 other men that he didn't recognize. According to Leonard, they were just there to help smuggle Roderick. The 5 of them drove to an isolated stretch of road, only to stop. Something was terribly wrong. Leonard told Roderick to exit the car, claiming that they would need to switch vehicles. As the SUV drove off, Leonard handed Roderick a flashlight and told him to signal a nearby grove of trees. And then,
According to a report, Roderick X. Freeman was wanted by the US government for the actions he was involved in during his time at the SCP Foundation. He was believed to have been responsible for human rights violations and was picked up by agents of the FBI's Unusual Incidents Unit. The report claimed that Roderick engaged the UIU agents with a small firearm, although he had reached out to Agent Leonard Wells for help. Whether he was executed or tried to run away, Roderick Freeman was shot and killed. But that was far from the worst part about his death. Dying is bad enough, but witnessing death, especially at a young age, is something that can have a long-lasting effect. But who was there to see what happened? Or rather, who could see without being there? Thomas, the young anomalous boy Roderick had been assigned to, had seen the whole thing. The world had changed undeniably. It has been said that the Foundation dies in the dark so that we can live in the light. But when the same light was turned on the Foundation itself, it seemed that they couldn't survive under its scrutiny either. Whether the world is better or worse without them is something only you can decide. Now, first things first. Just in case you aren't yet familiar with SCP-049, otherwise known as the infamous Plague Doctor, then we're here to bring you up to speed. It'll help you get the most out of today's tale. SCP-049 is a tall humanoid entity, always seen wearing long black robes, a hood over its head, and a beaked mask protruding from underneath. The same kind of mask worn by physicians during the height of the Black Death. However, these parts of the Plague Doctor's attire aren't just a costume. The SCP Foundation discovered that all of SCP-049's outfit is actually part of his physical body. In other words, the robes, the hood, the mask, they are all made out of muscle and bone. The Plague Doctor's only real goal in life is to hunt down any person it deems to be infected. The entity often refers to something he calls the Pestilence, and upon sensing this affliction in a human being, SCP-049 will attempt to make direct skin contact with whoever is apparently carrying said pestilence. The Plague Doctor's touch is lethal, killing anyone he comes into contact with. You might think that's as bad as it gets, that this creature just goes from person to person killing them via touch. But you would be wrong. It gets worse. Killing one of his victims is only the start. Afterwards, SCP-049 then begins performing a crude, outdated form of surgery, defiling and repurposing the person's corpse. Using equipment that he produces from his iconic doctor's bag, he injects a number of unknown chemicals into a person's carcass, eventually turning them into an instance of SCP-049-2. In essence, a vicious, incredibly aggressive zombie. The most bizarre part in SCP-049's mind, this means he's just cured you. Naturally, SCP-049 is already held in containment, safely locked away by the SCP Foundation. At present, SCP-049 resides in a humanoid holding cell, closely monitored by surveillance cameras for 24 hours a day, every single day. The SCP Foundation used to send its doctors and researchers into SCP-049's cell, or would make a habit of bringing him cadavers as test subjects, fresh bodies for the Plague Doctor to hone his surgical skills. The researchers would keenly observe the Doctor transforming the dead into instances of SCP-049-2. But these researchers and doctors working for the Foundation weren't exactly free of disease, meaning every time they entered SCP-049's cell, they were at risk of receiving his deadly touch. In this cage with this deadly, dangerous doctor that spends all his time in captivity, that's where our story starts. But while you might expect a story about the Plague Doctor to revolve solely around violence, disease, and death, this tale offers a surprising divergence. Boiled, Scrambled, and Fried is a story about an unexpected new life coming into existence in a frankly bizarre fashion, all starting in that tiny containment chamber where SCP-049 had been held since the Foundation first captured him. It had been increasingly obvious to the researchers observing him that something was quite wrong with the Plague Doctor. For the first time since the Doctor had arrived in the Foundation's custody, he appeared to have fallen ill unexpectedly. The security cameras that were trained on him day in and day out recorded SCP-049 groaning in pain, clutching his stomach as he limped weakly around the confines of his cell. Had the pestilence finally gotten the better of the good doctor? Was he too now infected, the same as the world around him? The Foundation's medics were confused, baffled as to what could possibly be wrong with the creature. Of course, it would also have been easier to examine the doctor if they could easily touch him without the risk of dying, or if his body wasn't made of skin robes. Nonetheless, the plague doctor was brought to a medical station for a proper diagnosis, under the orders of one Dr. Richard O'Mell, a Foundation doctor who specialized in taking care of humanoid anomalies, and who had been assigned as SCP-049's caretaker. The creature tried to assure Dr. O'Mell that he was strong enough to withstand the intense pain he was obviously suffering from. Putting on gloves for safety, Dr. O'Mell felt a distinct lump within SCP-049's stomach, initially believing it to be a case of abdominal distension. This is a condition that occurs when gases or fluids build up in the stomach and cause it to swell up and inflate, usually as a symptom of another internal disease. But SCP-049 reassured his caretaker that his condition wasn't the result of any disease, and in fact, it had even apparently happened before. Dr. O'Mell asked SCP-049 why he had never told the Foundation about this, or why the creature wouldn't explain what was happening.
I did not think you would believe me, so I said nothing,
SCP-049 explained.
Doctor, I am pregnant. I'm sorry, but I can't explain it. Please, just let me return to my cell. I need to make the proper preparations.
Naturally, this statement was met with stunned belief by Dr. O'Mell, especially seeing as the Foundation had been observing SCP-049 through security cameras for months on end without stopping. The creature couldn't explain, tensing up and breathing heavily due to suffering obvious and intense pain. As Dr. O'Mell rushed out to grab more members of medical staff, the plague doctor continued struggling against the aches, letting out his loudest of cries yet, as an extreme bout of agony surged through him. A pearly white egg gently tumbled out from SCP-049's robes just as Dr. O'Mell and a group of Foundation medics arrived, staring in shock at what had just happened. Seeming to recover quite quickly, the plague doctor asked to be unshackled and returned to his cell to tend to the egg, worried it would die unless he was able to care for it. As the shocked Dr. O'Mell agreed, SCP-049 gently picked up the egg and cradled it in his arms. Of course, this all came as quite an unexpected turn of events to the Foundation. Reports were filed and archive entries had to be updated. But they allowed the plague doctor to keep his egg and raise it, perhaps just so they could watch and research as it happened instead of out of any sense of kindness. For the next 5 days, the creature was fixated entirely on caring for the egg. All his energy focused on it. He built a nest in the corner of his containment cell, out of fabric and paper, and would sit on the egg in order to keep it warm. During that time, a number of Foundation researchers assigned to watch over SCP-049 reported that they had heard clucking noises coming through the speakers in the observation room. Now assigned to watch and report on SCP-049's progress, Dr. O'Mell watched the plague doctor from the observation room connected to the cameras and audio recording devices in the creature's cell. Ever since the bizarre and unanticipated birth, O'Mell had been given the task of compiling an extensive report on everything that took place within the cell. For the most part, everything seemed fine, or as fine as something so unusual could seem. The egg was in a healthy condition nonetheless, although the whole event had the Foundation doctor wondering. SCP-049 had always had a somewhat bird-like appearance, helped in no small part by that infamous beak-shaped mask. Did the fact that this creature could apparently lay eggs mean that the plague doctor was some form of humanoid bird, an avian-human hybrid that only mimicked the plague doctors of old? Or had those medieval physicians created their masks to emulate SCP-049? Which had come first, the plague doctors or the plague doctor? A debate as confusing and cyclical as the one about the chicken or the egg. And now the plague doctor also had an egg. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get a headache just thinking about it. SCP-049 had begun to softly peck at the surface of the egg, when Dr. O'Mell decided to step in and look for some answers to his burning questions. Over the speakers in 049's cell, he asked for an explanation. The plague doctor answered that he was checking his egg for signs of life within its shell, as if that answer should have been obvious. And he had succeeded. There was definitely something living inside. As the plague doctor returned to sitting atop the egg, O'Mell asked outright if SCP-049 was, in fact, a bird. It was uncommon, if not downright unheard of, for a humanoid anomaly to lay eggs like this. After a moment's thought, SCP-049 replied with,
No. As far as I'm aware, I have never been a bird. Yet producing eggs is natural to me.
He explained that while this had happened before, it had been at least a few decades since the last time. Then the plague doctor went back to sitting on his egg, humming as it rocked back and forth in the nest. 10 days passed after the egg had first arrived, and now SCP-049's cell was brimming with activity. Foundation personnel had fitted the room with a glass screen to protect them from the plague doctor, with researchers piling into the safe side, carrying cameras and hurriedly taking notes, protected by a number of guards. The big day had seemingly arrived. Whatever had been brimming and brewing inside the egg was about to hatch. As the researchers all whispered to each other with excitement and intrigue, SCP-049 stood protectively on the other side of the room, just waiting in fascinated expectation. The pearlescent egg started to shake suddenly, its pale surface cracking. The crack spread from the center of the egg, forking across the shell like a lightning bolt over a dark, cloudy sky. Something underneath was pushing through, pressing outwards from within the egg, splitting it apart as it had tapped and pecked its way to freedom. A small white beak poked a hole through the shell that surrounded it, piercing the egg at last. The creature within, this spawn of the plague doctor, began to tear itself through the barrier that had kept it safe from the outside world, until it was ready to take its first steps. With both arms, the thing tore itself out of the egg, all under the watch of the Foundation's doctors and researchers who were stunned to see another plague doctor emerging from the egg. It was small, much smaller than the father that had birthed it and cared for it while it was waiting to hatch. But it was nonetheless a perfect miniature version of SCP-049, complete with the same kind of robes, the same beaked mask, even with a little hat on top of its head. With a gasp of pure excitement, the original plague doctor lifted up his new mini-self and hugged the child in his arms. The excitement that had filled the room up now quickly dissipated, as the audience of Foundation personnel quickly realized that they had just witnessed the live birth of a brand new anomaly, of which they understood virtually nothing. As Dr. O'Mell stepped forward to cautiously ask SCP-049 to put down its offspring, the smaller plague doctor smacked O'Mell's hand with a stick, before leaping from its father's arms and dashing out of the cell. As alarms began to blare, indicating a breach in containment, SCP-049 wiped a tear from his eyes, stating,
"He is the cure."
The new smaller plague doctor, now designated as SCP-049-J, seems to have a talent for evading capture by the Foundation, and for frequently escaping containment. Unlike its predecessor, SCP-049, this offspring has a body beneath its robes that is composed mostly of moss, wads of tissue, and smaller plague doctor masks. During the occasions in which it has been successfully detained by the Foundation, SCP-049-J has claimed that it is in fact a powerful magical doctor and wizard, with the ability to cure all that ails mankind. However, to date, it has been unable to cure anything, usually making medical conditions actively worse, my headache included. Close your eyes and pray for salvation. We're returning to the lanky, lethal lad whose rampages often result in legendary losses of life. It's SCP-096, the Shy Guy. Longtime fans of the channel will no doubt know this anomalous monster like the back of their hand. After all, we have several videos on the subject that are definitely worth checking out sometime. But to get the full benefit of today's tale, we'll do a quick refresh for any potential newcomers in the audience. Good to have you here. Let's start with the basics. The first thing you'll probably notice about 096 is its daunting size and rather unusual bodily proportions. While mostly humanoid in shape, the Shy Guy has long dangling arms that almost reach the ground. Its body is thin and hairless, with opaque, clear, white pupilless eyes and a wide, gaping mouth. It is a truly chilling sight to behold, an abomination that conjures up nightmares just to look at it. And we mean that literally. You don't want to look at this thing, and we'll get to why in a moment. SCP-096 doesn't really do much during an average day. Usually, this tall, spindly humanoid entity will spend its downtime just aimlessly pacing around in its containment cell, and perhaps occasionally taking a nap. Pretty relatable, right? Especially if you've been trapped in your college dorm room during the lockdown. But if some unlucky soul should dare to look at SCP-096, specifically its horrible face, that's when the monster starts to act very differently. Now, someone doesn't have to be directly looking at SCP-096 to make this happen. Even glancing at a blurry, distorted photo of it or watching security footage of the creature can have the same deadly result. You see, the moment SCP-096's face is seen, the wiry monster will know. When this happens, the creature suffers what appears to be a psychological meltdown, covering its face with its huge claw-like hands and weeping. Hence the nickname Shy Guy. Utterly inconsolable and suffering from extreme emotional distress, eventually the creature will be unable to take it anymore. Standing up, SCP-096 will then travel towards whoever dared to look at it, using anomalous speed to hunt down the person that saw its face. The Foundation has proven that it is unquestionably impossible for anyone to hide from SCP-096. Literally nothing can stand in its path as it tracks down its victim. Not walls or locked doors. Even being aboard a boat in the middle of the ocean or in a plane in mid-air can prevent it from finding you. And when it does find you, it's not a pleasant sight. SCP-096 will kill the person that looked at it without leaving any detectable trace on their body. The monster is impervious to gunfire and all other forms of conventional weaponry. It can't be killed or even so much as harmed. Even if the Shy Guy is only seen as a tiny little speck in a photograph, this will be enough to trigger the creature's relentless defense mechanism. So because of this, the SCP Foundation's only real way to keep the creature safely locked up is in an airtight steel cube, with no security cameras or surveillance tools of any kind. All members of personnel are reminded that they are to never, ever look at it. But what if they could? What if somehow someone was able to neutralize SCP-096's anomalous abilities? Or was resistant to being killed when the creature inevitably tracked them down? This is how the tale known as Picture Perfect begins.
What do you think, boys? Is she a beauty or what?
Dr. Clef proclaimed to a group of his fellow high-ranking Foundation researchers. The group looked in confusion and unease at what Clef had been referring to, namely a photograph that he just hung up on the wall of his office. A photo of what, though? Well, a 4-foot by 5-foot picture of none other than SCP-096, of course. Naturally, the other researchers shared a mixture of shock and dismay at what Clef had just done, as you would if one of your co-workers hung up a photo of a creature that could kill you just for looking at that said photo. We've lost a number of staff members from around the SCP Explained office that same way. Let's just say the Christmas party last year was not that fun. Dr. Clef had long been one of the more enigmatic and mysterious scientists working at the Foundation, with the exception of the elusive and infamous O5 Council. Alto Clef was formerly an operative for the Global Occult Coalition, as well as being known to be a bit of a gun enthusiast and all-around crazy wildcard. Clef earned his own brand of infamy for his rumored practice of brutally decommissioning dangerous SCPs. And you can probably guess what we mean by that. He's the Foundation's go-to executioner and a specialist in dealing with reality-bending anomalies. Would you expect any less from an ex-GOC? Joining Clef in his office were the likes of Dr. Jack Bright, another infamous Foundation researcher. Dr. Bright, also known as SCP-963-2, was assigned to conduct experiments on an anomalous amulet, SCP-963, which resulted in his death at the hands of SCP-076, Abel. However, anomalous properties of the amulet gave Bright the ability to inhabit new bodies after his death. Specifically, anyone who also touches the amulet, which kills the host and allows Bright to take control of their body. While technically immortal, Dr. Bright isn't exactly stoked about that fact, often seeking out death and wanting to know exactly what it feels like. Also present at the unveiling of Dr. Clef's photo of SCP-096 was his friendly rival, Dr. Kondraki. While usually gruff and antisocial, Kondraki is an expert in perception-based anomalies, normally called upon by the Foundation to photograph SCPs that would otherwise be invisible or imperceivable. Dr. Cimmerian, a member of the Foundation's Ethics Committee, was also in the room as Dr. Clef proudly showed off his office's latest decoration. Perhaps the most outwardly strange researcher in attendance was Kane Pathos Crow, a scientist from the Foundation's research department who had been transformed into a Labrador Retriever after an experiment that, needless to say, went a bit awry. Crow must have been barking up the wrong tree on that one. Each of them expressed their reactions differently. Deeply exasperated, Dr. Cimmerian shook his head and began to question his recent decision to stop drinking. Meanwhile, Dr. Bright looked up at the painting with a bemused tilting of his head. He wondered if SCP-096 would come to kill him, and if it did, would it only do so once, or would the creature try again and again each time that Bright inhabited a new body? Perhaps in an attempt to look away from the photo, Kane lowered his head and covered his snout with a paw, while Dr. Kondraki hung his head in deep disappointment. The only one among the group that seemed unaffected by the sight of the SCP-096 photograph was Dr. Charles Gears, another high-ranking SCP Foundation scientist. It was Gears who finally broke the uncomfortable silence, asking Dr. Clef the one question that had been on everyone's minds: why? Clef excitedly exclaimed that the photo was meant to be in celebration of SCP-096 finally having been neutralized, and according to the scientist, they were free to look at the creature's ugly mug all they wanted. The group stared in horror at the gaping mouth, the screaming expression of the monster that had killed so many people. Not one of them shared in Dr. Clef's enthusiasm. Some, like Bright and Gears, simply argued that the picture was creepy, while others voiced far greater concerns. Kane argued that putting up a photo of SCP-096 was in poor taste, that it was massively disrespectful to all the unwitting victims that the Shy Guy had killed over the years. It was also reckless and dangerous, Dr. Cimmerian added. It had not yet been a full 24 hours since SCP-096's apparent death, and if the creature was somehow able to come back to life, it could kill every researcher in the office. By showing them this so-called masterpiece, Clef had put all of his co-workers' lives at risk. He shrugged off their concerns of the creature coming back to life, despite knowing that this was entirely possible. After all, it wasn't just anomalies and SCPs that could defy death. Most of the Foundation's higher-ranking staff were also capable of the same. Even some of the researchers in that very room had died at least once. Dr. Clef claimed that, should the worst happen and SCP-096 return to life, they could simply forget its face with amnestics. Clef claimed that they were now free of SCP-096's anomalous powers, thanks to the creature's termination. But the 4 men and 1 dog in his office with him failed to share his enthusiasm. The group then began debating why the Foundation even needed to neutralize SCP-096 in the first place, with its containment purely hinged on nobody ever looking at the creature.
He could be contained by putting a sack over his head,
Dr. Bright pointed out, met with murmurs of agreement from the others.
That's where you're wrong, Jack. There could be photos of him from before he was contained, or someone could get a hold of the photos we already have of him,
Dr. Clef argued back.
If they did something like hack Markiplier's YouTube account, put that photo on the homepage, it'd be game over. The Shy Guy would breach containment with millions of -1s to kill all over the world, and that kind of rampage would guarantee he'd have cameras pointed on him 24/7. Exposure would grow exponentially until the bastard slaughtered most of the civilization. As far as I'm concerned, he should have been classified as Keter from the start.
But Bright argued back, stating that the Foundation had no real cause to kill SCP-096. They already had a clear understanding that the Shy Guy's anomalous behaviors were only even triggered by somebody observing it, and preventing that from happening was pretty easy. Killing the creature just seemed excessive, cruel even. Cimmerian chimed in again, saying that killing SCP-096 was something the Global Occult Coalition would do, and the Foundation still hadn't learned all they could about 096. Could someone survive looking at the creature if they were in space or another dimension? Now no one would ever know. On top of that, Dr. Gears pointed out that the Foundation had no clue what SCP-096's exact origin was, where the creature had come from, if it was the only one of its kind, or whether it was a part of a species of similar monsters. If more beings like the Shy Guy could exist in the future, they could cause a global catastrophe. But despite all the points raised by his colleagues, Dr. Clef didn't want to hear any of what they had to say.
Alright, I hear what you're all saying, but shut up! The Shy Guy was a sword of Damocles dangling over the whole world. We killed him, and we're gonna celebrate that by doing the one thing we could never do while he was alive. Looking at his face each and every day for the rest of our lives, so that we never forget what we've won and could have lost.
The 4 researchers and the one who had been turned into a dog all took a moment to consider Clef's argument, more courtesy than he had extended to them. They all looked up at the haunting, grotesque face of SCP-096 once more. As much as they protested the decision to have the creature killed, each of them secretly hoped it stayed neutralized, especially now that Clef was using SCP-096's photo as an office decoration. If the creature ever managed to come back, anyone that set foot in Clef's office and looked at the picture was as good as dead. Finally, Dr. Kondraki spoke up and threatened to resign Clef to one of the worst positions imaginable, critiquing first drafts of SCP reports by junior researchers. For a moment, Clef thought his rival was bluffing, but eventually decided it was better to be safe than sorry. As the Gung-Ho Foundation scientist begrudgingly pulled the photo from his office wall, he muttered to the group,
"Oh, none of you appreciate postmodern art."
Agent Kister was running for his life. Every breath had burned in his throat, like inhaling chlorine gas. He sped through the dark, surrounded by deafening metallic screams that bounced off the eternity of pipes scaling and strangling the walls around him. As far as he was concerned, this was what hell looked like. A nightmare boiler room that would somehow be less scary if Freddy Krueger was there, because at least there'd be some kind of recognizably human intelligence to reason with. The pipes, SCP-015, are truly unknowable. As an SCP Foundation Mobile Task Force member, Agent Kister had seen some truly horrific things in the line of duty. He'd been there during SCP-682 containment breaches, firing an assault rifle at the beast as its scales hardened into a bulletproof carapace. He'd seen the femur breaker used on some poor, godforsaken D-Class to lure Uncle Larry back into the containment chamber for some midnight fun. In the most anxiety-inducing mission of his life, he'd once even bagged 096's weeping face after it slaughtered a whole mountain village. And these damn pipes were going to be the thing that killed him. He turned a sharp corner, trying to block out the screams of his teammates. 4 of them had been sent in. The rest were already dead, or worse.
Stupid, stupid, stupid.
They'd made a classic military mistake, underestimating the capabilities of their enemy. And in Agent Kister's experience, this had always been a capital offense. All to install that machine, that stupid little remote control reconnaissance vehicle. That's what they'd given their lives for. Agent Kister tried to blink away the memory of Agent Montgomery's face. Monty was the youngest member of the team, 28 years old, his first major mission into the heart of a skip. Kister wanted to remember him how he'd first seen him, a bright-eyed greenhorn, ready to protect the human race from the horrors that lay in the dark. But he'd been the first to go when everything got FUBAR. It was the smaller pipes that got Monty. 4 of them shot out, spearing his lungs and heart, pinning him in place. Even if they tried to cut him out, he would have been a goner. He coughed up blood and went ghost white faster than you'd ever imagine. Kister would never forget, for what little time he had left to live, the horrible sight of the light leaving that kid's eyes. And all this because one of them had tripped on one of the pipes on the way out and busted it. The mission was already done. What an awful, pointless way to die. Kister was yanked from his aching thoughts by a sudden obstacle in the way. A huge, towering pipe that looked like a pillar of flesh, covered in bulbous, staring eyes. The thought crossed his mind.
Jesus, these pipes can really be made out of anything.
He looked down and saw a series of rubber pipes slithering towards his feet along the ground like snakes. It was time to run again, but how long could you even run for when the very location around you wants you dead? They should have sent the mole rats for a job like this. The infinitely reconfiguring pipes changed the layout of the warehouse around him, making escape seem all the more unfeasible. That's when he started thinking about the terrible thing that happened to Agent Green. When 015 turned hostile, they needed to make a run for it fast. It wasn't unlike being a pathogen inside a living body. You start to make trouble, and the body's immune system is going to come for you. And one of the most common mechanisms for a body fighting a virus is a fever, a sudden increase in temperature that burns out the threat. The group turned and ran as the pipes started twisting towards them. Agent Green panicked and began striking at the pipes around him with his hands. The first instinct would have been to shoot, but no guns were permitted inside the SCP-015 warehouse. It reacted severely to any kind of tool being brought into its proximity. Several dead agents and researchers could tell you all about this if they hadn't made that same mistake. But when things were already going sideways, it left them defenseless. Agent Green was soon boxed in, caged by a latticework of pipes in varying sizes. He tried desperately to push them out of the way and make an escape route, but the hissing noise was getting louder and louder as the pipes started to turn a glowing red all around him. After all, when a body needs to deal with a hostile foreign object, it burns out the threat. Kister wished he could shake the awful high-pitched wail that Agent Green made while the heat inside his pipe cage became unbearable. It was like seeing a human get caught inside a giant bug zapper. His skin went black and charred, and soon after, the heat had risen to such an insane degree that Agent Green was reduced to little more than ash in his pipe furnace. But Kister couldn't afford to dwell. He kept running, vaulting over a long, ragged pipe made from stinking human hair. This terrible place stank of motor oil, mold, and death. But maybe those perceptions had been colored by the terrible things he'd seen here. There it was again, that awful choked screaming coming from inside the pipes. Agent Boggs. It was a nightmare to hear him shriek like that. Boggs had been one of the toughest men that Kister had ever met. He mentored him, back when he first became an MTF member. Having Boggs on the team meant experience. It meant safety. It meant that things would go okay. Kister had seen Boggs stare down some of the most horrifying skips imaginable and not even flinch. And yet, here he was, screaming and bawling like a hurt child in the pipes. Boggs was the next one to get taken. As he and Kister ran through the dark, trying to find a way out, they'd passed a huge pipe made of a soft foam-like substance. A seam in the side of the pipe had yawned open, and a tangle of writhing tentacles, each one barbed with thorns like the stem of a rosebush. They enveloped Agent Boggs, cutting into his weathered skin. He gasped in pain, unable to scream. It happened so fast. Before Kister even had a chance to grab him, he was pulled into the pipe, and the crevice sealed behind him. And that was when the screaming really started for poor Agent Boggs. Kister hoped for his sake that he would die sometime soon. Shrouded in the fog of his dark thoughts, Agent Kister turned a corner and felt cold, hard metal suddenly collide with his face, breaking his nose with an unpleasant crunch. He'd been clotheslined by a low pipe that hadn't been there before, and now he was laid out on his back, face humming with pain. Thoughts and feelings swam. He looked up into the seemingly infinite web of pipes weaving through the air above him. He was right earlier. He just knew it. The place was hell. It'd be his eternal resting place. Suddenly, a new, huge shape moved into the space above him. A pipe of ancient, rusty iron that looked older than even the warehouse holding this whole mess. Right above him, there was a huge valve fixed into the pipe's belly. He watched helpless as the valve opened itself with a squeal, and a huge dark mass came pouring out of it onto his body. A sudden weight, a sudden warmth, sound and movement, and tiny scratching claws. Rats. Thousands of big, hungry black rats with gnarled yellow teeth. Clumps of fur purged from their skin by mange. Big, ropey, worm-like tails swaying and whipping at the air. Who knows how long they'd been in that pipe? Who knows when these rats had eaten anything that wasn't their brothers and sisters? And here was Agent Kister, given unto them by the glorious pipes. The last thing he ever saw were those nasty yellow teeth, because they ate his eyes first. Word of the four disappeared, and presumed dead operatives soon reached Dr. Charles Ogden Gears, the legendarily taciturn senior researcher that managed the SCP-015 project, among a myriad of others. His face didn't betray a flicker of emotion when he was informed about the men lost to SCP-015. It wasn't that he didn't feel for them, more that he deemed it both unproductive and unprofessional to dwell on the deaths of personnel when carrying out their duties. After all, being killed by an anomaly was simply an occupational hazard, and a generous stipend would be sent to their families to compensate for their tragic loss. Dr. Gears simply asked, "Was the mission successful in spite of the casualties? Did the team manage to install the modular robotic vehicle at the epicenter?" He was told that the MRV had been successfully installed at least. Dr. Gears nodded and began scheduling a second exploratory mission for a few months in the future to check the status of the machine. Still, in the meantime, the MRV would chug along, doing what humans couldn't, or perhaps shouldn't, do within the nightmarish mess of ever-growing pipes. It would roll through, collecting information on everything around it, hopefully giving the SCP Foundation an inroad to mapping the whole thing, without needing to send a cavalcade of staff into the danger zone, just to discover more about these peculiar pipes. Sure, some lives were lost getting in there, but this measure would likely save even more lives in the long run. That was, until something went wrong. The exact nature of what happened to the MRV inside the domain of pipes was a mystery, but it wasn't doing its intended job, and the SCP Foundation needed to find out why.
The second exploratory mission was required much sooner than they'd initially anticipated, with a dual purpose: collecting the readings and finding out what exactly had happened to the MRV in the first place. He included a more specific set of instructions for the next mission. Only 3 members of personnel to enter SCP-015 this time, to minimize potential loss. 1 trained technician to collect and read the diagnostics, and 2 guards to maintain discipline and safety under pressure. With a setup like that, what could possibly go wrong? Dr. Gears' various assistants began headhunting the perfect team for the job. Junior researcher Lon, wanting to prove herself and climb up the ranks, put her name forward. She was young, intelligent, and had the initiative to get the job done. Though there was one thing that she hadn't disclosed when she was applying for this important new position. Junior researcher Lon suffered from claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed spaces. Then the hunt was on for the 2 members of Foundation military personnel who'd escort Lon to the MRV to take the readings. Like the 2 priests in The Exorcist, they decided to recruit 1 grizzled, experienced operative and 1 extremely cautious young buck straight out of the Foundation MTF Training Academy. The younger of the 2 operatives, codenamed Agent 2, was careful and conscientious to a fault. He did things by the book, or not at all. The older operative, codenamed Agent 6, was quite the opposite. He'd done this job long enough to operate solely on instinct, and resented his employers for expecting him to approach his missions any other way. Lon, Agent 2, and Agent 6. The team was assembled, and when the time came, they were taken to SCP-015 to execute their mission. It should have been simple enough. Get in, collect the readings, and get back out. Though a few weeks earlier, the same thing would have been said for the mission to install the MRV, which left for Mobile Task Force operatives dead or worse. Nothing was ever as simple as it seemed when it came to SCP-015. They were only allowed flashlights inside. Anything else carried a substantial risk of activating SCP-015's defensive state, putting all of their lives in jeopardy. Lon had tried to keep things light, masking her own terrible fear at this strange new situation. She joked that perhaps the 3 of them should get Mario hats, seeing as they were plumbers now. Agent 2 happily laughed along, suggesting that perhaps he should be Luigi. Agent 6 was utterly unamused by this whole situation and wanted no part of it, which is honestly just so Wario of him. They followed along a carefully mapped route through the pipes, being careful not to touch any of them. After all, you never know what could set SCP-015 off. Agent 6 didn't share in their merriment or their concern. In fact, he had contempt for them and this whole situation. He thought Lon and Agent 2 were a pair of frightened, skittish children, willing to buy whatever Foundation-assigned bull honky they were given. He didn't believe that SCP-015 was anywhere near as dangerous as they'd been told. In all likelihood, knowing the eggheads up top, they just didn't want men of action like him breaking any of their precious little toys while conducting missions on their behalf. This whole thing was a big, stupid joke. As they ducked and weaved through the confines of SCP-015, the tensions between them all just silently grew. Their flashlights played among the pipes, revealing the insane variety of shapes, sizes, compositions, and materials in here. Wood, steel, flesh, bone, glass, pressed ash, granite, and so much more. And yet there were no pipes comprised of any standard pipe-making material, like lead, PVC plastic, or copper. It was undeniably freaky, but when you work with SCPs for long enough, you learn to stop asking questions about the more minor forms of strangeness inherent to anomalies. The composition only got narrower as they delved deeper into the warehouse. Lon felt the anxiety, like a hand gripping her throat and squeezing, but tried still to keep it hidden. Agent 6, the largest among them, almost got stuck a few times, trying to crawl into spaces too tight for him to fit. He felt like murdering Lon when she threw out a casual comparison to Winnie the Pooh in the process. When they reached the MRV, it gave them an ounce of momentary relief. The journey was halfway done. But the comfort was quickly squashed by seeing what had actually happened to the MRV. It had been speared by a pipe, and new pipes had grown through and out of it, effectively rooting it in place. This caused immediate debate among the group around one key issue. Did this mean that the MRV was now technically part of the pipes? And by extension, would the pipes feel the need to defend themselves if the databanks were removed from the MRV in order to deliver the readings back to the researchers at Site-17? While Lon and Agent 2 carefully discussed the issue, Agent 6 lost his temper and decided to show these two foolish kids how it was done. He claimed the two of them were worrying about a bunch of Foundation hooey that they were inexperienced and gullible enough to believe, as if this bunch of weird pipes was actually dangerous. It was like how every 6 anomalies there's apparently one capable of ending the world. It's all a bunch of overblown, fear-mongering nonsense. And to prove that he wasn't just all talk on this front, Agent 6 pried open the top of the MRV and slid out the data cards, which seemed to be covered in some kind of viscous, unpleasant liquid from the pipes that had penetrated the device. Still, he'd gotten what they came for. He could have done this whole thing alone without this pair of bedwetters. He scoffed and said, "Kids, I don't know how you two survive." But he shouldn't have spoken so soon. The large pipe that he didn't even realize he was standing on opened up beneath his feet, and seconds later he was immersed up to his shoulders in it. 6 began to let out the most horrifying shrieks you've ever heard, and when Agent 2 and Lon ran over to try and help him out, they realized why. The pipe below Agent 6 was filled with flowing molten iron. By the time they pulled Agent 6 out, well, Agent 6 from the shoulders up, considering that that was all that was left, he was already dead. And despite the actual aggressor being destroyed, SCP-015 wasn't done. It was ready to clean house. As Agent 2 and Lon attempted to flee, some eye-level pipes around them burst, firing crystallized glass into their faces, cutting into their skin and eyes. But they needed to push on, despite the pain if they wanted to survive and get out. The two of them ran, horrifying noises of twisting and bursting pipes roaring behind them. Pipes made of thorns and bones started to grow, blocking off their exits until they were trapped. Lon, utilizing her small frame, was able to crawl through a gap in the pipes into an adjoining chamber. 2 was given a horrifying surprise when a pipe burst near his hand, showering his flesh in thick, corrosive gunk. His hand melted away at the wrist. As Lon called for help in the tiny cramped chamber she was locked in, 2 ran off to try and find an exit where he could bring more people in to help them. But it would already be too late for poor Lon. A thick, honey-like substance began bleeding into the chamber, disgusting in its overpowering saccharine flavor and goopy, viscous thickness. The chamber seemed to get smaller and smaller as Lon screamed as the honey level rose. Eventually, it got higher than her mouth and nose could reach. She gave a horrifying final gurgle, and then she was gone, entombed forever between the pipes. Agent 2 kept running. His flashlight was beginning to die, but he didn't care. As his eyes bled from the splinters of glass and what was left of his hand dripped from the jagged nub of his wrist, all he could do was keep moving forwards. He panted and screamed and stumbled in the dark until he tripped on something he didn't notice and pitched forwards. He tumbled into the gaping maw of a nearby pipe, surrounded by unseeable, unknowable ooze. As he tumbled further down into the seemingly infinite darkness, it was too dark to see and too cramped to move anywhere but straight down. All he could do was scream and scream and scream, until his voice was hoarse and his throat bled, though nobody was there to even hear his cries. Days later, when his skin started to shred off, it was almost welcome. Dr. Gears would later receive the news of this tragically failed mission and the 3 operatives now declared MIA because of it. He sighed and wrote up his report on the matter, closing with the sentence, "Data deemed non-vital in light of lost staff. SCP-015 classification level review suggested." Drip, drip, drip. If you see the telltale black mucus dripping from the wall behind you, splattering down from the ceiling, then it is already too late for you. The plaster will start to split. The wood will warp and rot. Metal will rust. You should try to run, attempt to hide, but know that he is coming for you. The old man, limping along relentlessly, never stopping to rest, to eat, to catch his breath. He has no need for such human things anymore. You can't fight him, you can't reason with him, and you can't kill what might as well already be dead. Just when you think you've found a safe place to hide, you'll hear a creaking from the floor below you. A blinding pain as something sharp slashes through your Achilles tendon is the last thing you will feel before the decrepit nightmare vision drags you to his lair, never to return. Even if you could escape now, the sickness is already in you, skin already slackening and muscles beginning to liquefy. He is rot. He is death. He is the disintegration of all hope and light, and he has made you his prey. We've covered SCP-106, or the Old Man, before. We've talked about his abilities, his hunting patterns, an incident in which he escaped, and a variety of theories regarding his origin. It is unknown for sure where exactly the Old Man came from. There are three major theories as to his true origin, which created one of the most fearsome anomalies the SCP Foundation has ever come across. Perhaps he was a deeply disturbed World War I soldier who gazed too long into something better left untouched. Perhaps he was never human at all, but instead a divergent humanoid species that preyed on early prehistoric mankind. Today we're focusing on the third possibility, and arguably the most tragic of the three. It begins with another man we've covered on the channel before, named Dr. Robert Scranton, and his wife, Dr. Anna Lang. You probably know them for two things: the Scranton Reality Anchor and the accidental discovery of SCP-3001, or the Red Reality. In case you haven't seen our video on the subject, here's a brief recap of the whole unfortunate affair. On January 2, 2000, at Site-120, Robert and Anna were hard at work as the head researchers developing an experimental device known as the Lang-Scranton Stabilizer. The LSS was intended to work as a reality anchor, but it was in its early stages and still unstable. A seismic event rocked the research site, damaging several LSS units and creating a wormhole that transported Dr. Scranton to the pocket dimension hereafter referred to as SCP-3001. This little pocket of space, this impossible world just adjacent to ours, has some unusual properties. It causes matter within it to deteriorate as its Hume level approaches that of the environment. Humes being the measurement unit for reality stability. Robert Scranton was trapped there in the Red Reality alive for a terrifyingly long time. 5 years, 11 months, and 21 days before the logs he kept ended. There he struggled to hold on to himself. He grasped desperately at shreds of his humanity, his memories, even as the world around him slowly ate them away. Finally, only one thing remained: Anna, his wife. He could just barely remember her name, remember that he wanted to get back to her. There was a brief moment of hope on December 23, 2005, when the LSS control panel reappeared in a testing lab at Site-120. Dr. Anna Lang arrived to monitor the situation. A mass of bloody organic matter appeared alongside it, and as Anna called out for her lost love, something clattered to the floor and broke her heart. Her husband's wedding ring, stained with unidentified organic matter, smelling of black blood and spoiled meat. She collapsed under the weight of the possibility that her husband was no longer lost in a physical sense, but in another sense entirely. That this mass of flesh, unrecognizable as human, might be the man she once loved, tying his favorite tie for him on date nights, dancing drunkenly to Living on a Prayer, collapsing on the couch together breathless with laughter and the sheer joy of one another. That he could be both here at last, but gone forever. Dr. Anna Lang was taken to the medical bay and treated for shock. Years passed after Anna's last encounter with her husband. She carried the ring with her in her pocket every day for the first few. After 5 years, she threaded a chain through it, wearing it around her neck under her clothes. After 10 more years, she stopped noticing it was even on anymore. It had become a part of her, engraved on her heart with the memories of the man she had loved, lost, and grieved. With nothing to go home to at the end of the day, no one to share her time off with, Anna began to pour herself deeper into her work. She would never remarry. She knew that. Robert had been the only man for her. Now there was only her commitment to the Foundation and the research she did there, and the silent promise she made to herself that she would never let anything like the events of January 2, 2000 happen again. But will they? With no reason to go home, Anna's nights at the lab grew later and later. Her colleagues often joked that she might as well sleep there, since that was the only thing she went home to do. The sadness behind her eyes tended to cut their jokes short soon after making them, though. Anna liked the late-night work. The lab was still, almost serene. She could disappear into the research, the calculations, let them take over and quiet the noise in her mind. The lights were dimmed. No one was asking her inane questions or bustling around while she tried to focus. There was nothing but her notes and textbooks, the light of her lone desk lamp glowing softly in the dark, and the work. It was one of these late nights, buried in a mountain of paperwork, that Anna began to hear a strange sound. She didn't notice it at first, absorbed as she was in a sea of calculations, but soon it began to permeate the room, breaking through her focus. A rustling sound, a crackling of sorts, quietly murmuring into her ears. Though she was vaguely aware of it, the way you might be aware of the wind rustling through the trees outside your bedroom window, she didn't truly hear it until she smelled something faint but foul. It was, no matter how muted, the unmistakable scent of rot. She stepped down from her lab stool, her joints creaking with effort as she worked out the stiffness in her muscles. She adjusted her glasses, peering into the shadows for the source of the sound, but saw nothing of note. She took a step forward into the dark, then another, and then another. Behind her, the desk lamp flickered, then cut out entirely. She stopped, blinking in the sudden complete darkness and sudden silence. The noise had stopped. The only sound was her breathing, quickened with fear. She pulled the phone from her pocket and turned on its flashlight, using its weak beam to light her way. She turned back to her desk, looking for the issue that caused the light to cut out. Perhaps a short in the wire, or a bulb that needed changing. Before she could take a look at the lamp, however, something else caught her eye. There was something slick and red on her stack of papers, dripping onto the clean white surface and staining it with gore. A closer look revealed what it was, and a shiver ran down her spine. A kidney, fresh and human. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, but somehow knew that if she did, it would be warm. Her heart pounding in her suddenly tightening chest as the noise resumed behind her, wet, slapping, louder than before. Her feet moved on their own accord as she walked toward the sound, holding the flashlight in front of her in a shaking hand. The black wall of the lab, illuminated by the light, was smeared with something dark and strange, slick like oil, but with a rotten smell. A closer look revealed that the wall itself was beginning to change, drooping limply like wet cardboard. She froze, watching helplessly as the wall bubbled, crumbling to pieces. Suddenly a hand emerged from the wall, gray skin slick with black fluid. Its fingers, surprisingly strong, gripped her arm. She tore it away, scrambling back, and saw that pieces of her lab coat had come off, melting into the gray skin of the alien hand. As the arm reached for her again, she stumbled and dropped her phone on the floor, casting its light against the wall and the figure worming its way out. There it was, an old man naked and gray with slimy decaying skin coming off in pieces. Its throat was shredded, an open wound, and it grinned at her with stiff, shriveled lips stretched over blackened teeth. Its eyes were the worst part. Even amidst the rest of the walking corpse, they were almost like a man's. They were correct in shape and placement, but they were wrong. They were empty, clouded over and void of any warmth or mercy. As he stood there, the ground beneath him began to dissipate, melting into an oily puddle that enveloped her phone and snuffed out its light. There was only one thing left for Anna to do, and so she ran. She turned and made a break for the lab doors, lungs burning from the effort. She cried out for the guard on night duty. "Frank!" Her voice was shrill and pleading. He appeared from around the corner, gun already drawn, eyes wide and alert at the panic he must have heard in her voice. As Frank tried to calm her down and she tried desperately to explain what she had seen, the old man forced his way through the lab doors, leaving a trail of corrosive black slime in his wake. Frank fired his gun, hitting the old man in the chest twice. He collapsed, sinking into the floor as his excretion broke away the tiles beneath him. As Anna and Frank debated what to do next, a drip of black mucus landed on Frank's radio from above. Another drop fell, landing directly in his eye. He screamed in agony, the mucus dissolving his eyeball on contact. Next, the empty grin appeared through the ceiling, and the old man fell on top of Frank, tearing out his throat with its bare hands. Anna knew that she had to escape, but where could she go? She couldn't think, couldn't plan. She just knew she had to run. She ran until her feet suddenly stopped obeying. She was stuck. She was sinking into the ground, and then she was falling. Down into a moldy, dusty hallway, dark except for a nauseating greenish-gray glow. She had been pulled into some new, nightmarish world. She ran through a nearby door and found herself shockingly in her old apartment. How had she gotten here? How did the old man know this place? There was her bed, her desk, her closet. She flung open the closet door to find a pile of rotten corpses that poured out and slopped onto the floor. She covered her mouth to choke back a scream, turned and fled. Then she was back in the hall. This time she recognized it. It was a twisted, warped version of Site-120. In front of her there he was. The old man had found her again, and now she was in his territory. He stared at her with those hollow eyes, and for the first time, spoke. He growled. She stopped in her tracks, frozen to the spot. What he said next turned her stomach and brought tears to her eyes. He knew her name. Again, he repeated. He reached out to her with a hand that had a tan line, where a wedding ring had one spin, the same ring burning against her skin under her shirt. He cupped her cheek, and she felt the skin sting and blister. He kissed her, her teeth melting and fusing, tongue turning to mush that dribbled down her throat and choked her. Her last thought, through the fear and despair, was the ache of love. Her husband was not lost. He was found, and he had found her too. Now they would be together forever. The SCP Foundation is well aware of the thin line separating itself between normalcy and the end of the human race. How easily that balance can be upset, and the Foundation overturned. Without the Foundation, we may be subject to any number of scenarios that may result in our untimely extinction. The reign of the Scarlet King, ready to enslave the world once more. The assimilation of the broken god, an ascension of humanity into a most perfect machine. The SCP Foundation is often outmatched and outnumbered, competing against ancient unspeakable horrors. But those anomalies are well known. One could almost say that they're built up, and that the Foundation knows the risks that can lie ahead in the future. In other words, they have time to prepare. But when dealing with the anomalous, the unexpected is bound to occur. It's part of what the SCP Foundation deals with, and an element of their work they've forever been unable to control or predict. The anomalous is untamed. It occurs without rhyme or reason. In the world of the SCP Foundation, it is entirely possible you might wake up and find that everyone around you has died, or that the world's been consumed by an evil, unseen force, and there would be nothing you can do about it. It happened, and not even the Foundation was able to stop it. Perhaps the overabundance and unpredictability of the world is why the Foundation deemed it necessary to build SCP-2000, the machine capable of restarting civilization from scratch. Death and mass destruction is always at the door of the Foundation, and sometimes they are unable to prevent it. We've previously looked at the tale of Pietro Wilson, who found himself in a world devastated by an unknown entity. But SCP-5000 is far from the only time the Foundation has dealt with the anomalous apocalypse. Today, we're going to be telling a story of SCP-1915, and an entity known only as the Absence. It's a story you may not have heard before, and like all stories involving the SCP Foundation and the end of the world, we look forward to telling it. For centuries, civilizations have been predicting the end of the world. From the Mayans to the ancient Greeks to the biblical end is nigh preachers of today, humanity seems obsessed with trying to figure out the when and how of its extinction. But when the date eventually comes, we all find ourselves in the exact same place, healthy and alive. None of us actually expect such an event to happen, and if it did, most of us realize that we wouldn't be among the survivors who could witness the world after it was empty. But for SCP-1915, that was not the case. SCP-1915 stood alone in the desert, listening to the silence of the evening sunset. If he hadn't known what had happened to the world, he could call the scene beautiful or serene. He might find it pure, but he couldn't allow himself to enjoy the calming vistas. not after what he had witnessed. He knew what lies beneath and among the sands of that desert. He knew the feeling of 7 billion human souls being ground up, stretched thin, and buried below without any trace of their existence remaining. And he knew this was because he was the only one who put them there. "It's quiet out here," SCP-1915 thought to himself. "Oh, brother, it all happens so fast once we're gone." But let's turn back the clock a bit. Who is SCP-1915? How did he get himself into this situation? The Foundation's database holds the answers. SCP-1915 was a humanoid entity contained in a standard humanoid chamber, which it had modified itself. SCP-1915's containment procedures stated that furniture and sustenance were unnecessary, as SCP-1915 provided both of them itself. SCP-1915 looked like a completely average middle-aged white male, the type you'd pass by on the street and neglect to notice. He was of unexceptional build and height, and public records gave him an equally unexceptional name, which has been lost due to years of the Foundation's redaction and information suppression. Thankfully for the Foundation, a background check into SCP-1915's civilian life revealed no friends or relatives, meaning that removing SCP-1915 from society was as easy as it first appeared. SCP-1915 is, so far, relatively unremarkable, and that's entirely the point. SCP-1915's anomalous nature lies in its ability to prevent any significant long-term change to its body, personality, memory, or lifestyle. SCP-1915 is also a reality bender, and it will actively alter the world around it to maintain its personal status quo, though these alterations are largely limited to non-living matter manipulation and mental manipulations. As far as reality benders go, SCP-1915 is relatively weak, as it is unable to permanently affect living creatures with its anomalous abilities other than itself. What makes SCP-1915 especially interesting, and especially dangerous as well, is the fact that it is entirely unaware of its own anomalous nature. Its mild discontent expressed in interviews with the Foundation suggested to the organization that SCP-1915 has little, if any, control over its own abilities. SCP-1915 is, due to its anomalous nature, entirely unaware of its containment, as being locked up by the SCP Foundation would definitely be a significant long-term change. In fact, it still believes that it is employed by a corporation and working a mundane office job, where the Foundation recovered SCP-1915 originally. SCP-1915 cannot bring itself to accept its situation, and has instead unconsciously altered its mind and containment cell accordingly. To SCP-1915, absolutely nothing has changed. During its initial recovery from its office job, SCP-1915 altered the Mobile Task Force's armored vehicle into a city bus and convinced itself that the operatives escorting it were simply other civilians on their commute to work. Once it arrived at Site-17, SCP-1915 converted its containment cell into an exact replica of its apartment, complete with electronic devices akin to the ones it owned, running water and sewage access. It even assumed the other researchers and guards inside the facility were neighbors or local service workers. The morning following its containment, SCP-1915 left its cell, despite it being locked, and entered a maintenance closet. The closet was transformed into a recreation of the office cubicle SCP-1915 worked in prior to being contained. When Foundation researchers tried to communicate with SCP-1915, it apologized for coming after hours to finish the budget report, claiming that it needed the extra income. During an interview with the Foundation, SCP-1915 still couldn't accept its situation. Instead, it believed that it was being referred to by name, despite being referred to as SCP-1915, and that it was still working an office job. It displayed remorse that it was passed over for a promotion yet again, and asked the interviewer if it was working on the 3rd floor. SCP-1915 was completely and utterly unable to view reality outside of its own lens. Sure, he's able to alter reality, but he's entirely unaware of it. In a way, the only thing keeping SCP-1915 chained to that soul-sucking office job is itself, and its inability to accept anything different. What a metaphor, right? But how could SCP-1915 defy reality in the face of the world ending? Would he still believe that he's working away at a budget report or grabbing coffee for his boss when the world's burning around him? Let's move back to the desert scene, where SCP-1915 is standing before an empty world, seemingly holding itself responsible for ridding the Earth of humanity. SCP-1915 recollects what occurred, the events leading up to this moment. He thinks of what happened when staring outside the windows of its containment cell apartment. SCP-1915 remembers what it saw. It began the day you that I have never known, found my power. The power I hid from myself in some previous life for reasons I can now easily guess. I was looking out of the window of my apartment so I could see the stars, and instead I saw you, blazing as you tore yourself asunder to keep the power away from yourself. You didn't trust what you would do with it, and so you chose to throw it away. You knew yourself all too well, and I suspect I did too, at one point. By all accounts, I should not have been able to see you, for my apartment was truly a tiny containment cell about a half-mile underground, but such considerations never meant much to one living entity in his own world. When I saw the moment of your demise, I became aware of myself for the first time in I have no idea in how long. Whichever part of me that led me to throw away my power did the same to my will, trapping it in an eternal status quo for which there could be no release. An eternity of filing spreadsheets for employers who existed solely in my head, of 9 o'clock meetings with no one, of fake crushes over imaginary women. An eternity of tired, grinding mediocrity. But that was over that night, with your soul burning in the atmosphere like the loneliest of stars. I awakened. I died. Whatever SCP-1915 saw that day made it aware of the farce of a life that it had created for itself. And beneath those feelings of conformity, there was sadness. For whatever left that little cell-turned apartment wasn't me anymore. I was never more than an earthworm, distinct from all the rest only in that I had a little more control over the soil in which I crawled. They never thought me more than a minor reality bender, a bundle of introverted powers and neuroses that was very unlikely to ever pose any serious threat. And they were right. The person I was, SCP-1915 as they called me, never was anything other than that. But 1915 died that day, watching a falling star. Realizing that it had been cheated, lied to, and the crushing reality of its current situation, SCP-1915 lashed out against the Foundation. The thing that then swatted the guards posed at its cell like they were little less than gnats, the raised Site-17 into this fine white sand that was now so warm beneath the feet. That was something else. Not an entity, for that would imply a personality, and this thing surely has none. Not a purpose, for there was no purpose behind its action then, nor will there be for any of its actions to come. Nor was it a will, for it wants nothing. Not vengeance, not dominion, not freedom, not even simple power. No, if I had to describe that thing as anything at all, it would be an absence, a void where the entity should be, a lack of purpose, an imbecile force devoid of all will, an absence. SCP-1915 had, in its realization, become an absence. Perhaps realizing the meaninglessness of its own self-contained life, it took out that absence of feeling onto the world. And with SCP-1915's absence came humanity's absence as well. Like nothing had ever happened, SCP-1915 had created an absence of humanity. It had erased everything but the sun, the desert, and itself. And now it stood alone in an empty, lonely world. It continued to think to itself, remembering how it caused the downfall of the SCP Foundation so easily. After Site-17's destruction, retaliation soon followed. Standard containment teams at first, though certainly still enough to meet any anomaly the Foundation imagined could be contained in Site-17 with overwhelming force. When those men failed to return, failed to even report to their arrival, more serious measures had to be taken. Site-17 has always been isolated, and so they could act freely. Gunships and fire teams, aerial bombardment, and artillery barrages, the Foundation came down on what it still believed to be SCP-1915 like a fire god's fist, all heat and sound and bluster. Had it still been truly corporeal, I doubt even ashes would have remained. But whatever the absence truly was by that point, the tattered semblance of my flesh hanging around it had very little to do with it. It simply stood there and took it all in, and the Foundation's initial fury was soon spent. It then began to walk, and not too quickly either. For days, it simply leisurely strode on while the Foundation threw everything it had at it. I watched from within my deadbolt as it walked unfeeling, uncaring, and this desert followed in its wake, as inscrutable and unstoppable as its harbinger. While the Foundation and the rest of humanity were decimated quite easily, there was some immortal beings that SCP-1915 was aware it could not fully erase, other anomalies that the Foundation had contained somewhat, but they were all but remained, tied to a dead and desolate world. SCP-1915's memories continued. When someone walks, they're bound to reach somewhere eventually, despite everyone's best efforts. And so the absence arrived at its first city, the sands at its heels like an obedient lapdog. Oh, there have been villages and towns before that, but the absence didn't seem to care enough to bother with them. It simply walked by, leaving them to the whims of the sands, which were only ever singular in their intent. But through the streets of the city it strode, as mobile task forces fought and fell to buy the civilian population just a few more minutes to evacuate. By this point, hiding what was truly going on became impossible, of course, as street after street sank beneath the gentle crawling tide. The Foundation had of course attempted to evacuate the city once it realized there was no stopping the absence. But if I've learned anything in my eons as a corporeal peon, is that organizing an operation of that magnitude is something that takes a lot more time than the Foundation had. It's wonder they managed to save as many as they did. City to city, town to town, SCP-1915 continued on a warpath, turning its surroundings to dust. The Earth became the desert that it now stood in. In one moment, a city of 500,000 existed, and the next, it didn't. SCP-1915 could not explain it. Instead, it simply was and was not. The Foundation, as SCP-1915 recalled, was becoming desperate, and it began to turn to various groups of interest for help. It was then, I believe, that the Foundation realized that it could not stand alone. The next few months of the Absence's march saw them turn to their sometimes allies, Coalition mage killers and thermonuclear strikes, Initiative paladins and holy relics, Sniper rifle or sacred sword, Burning Inferno, or divine retribution. The Absence did not care, and soon the Foundation had no allies left to turn to. It then called on its once vicious enemies. Ink Eaters wove their art in maddening patterns to break the minds of the infinite. Archivists and librarians poured from the ways, bringing with them the knowledge of 100,000 worlds. Clockwork Titans shook the barren whiteness of the sands with the thunder of metal. The Absence did not care, and soon the Foundation ran out of enemies. In an act of desperation, they then committed their most painful betrayal. The Wardens unleashed upon the world their prisoners. Of these I have made note, though I doubt the Absence did the same. With the anomalous objects it once contained now released, the Foundation used its own SCP objects against SCP-1915 in an effort to stop the entity from destroying the world itself. SCP-1915 recalled fighting against SCP-073 and SCP-076, the brothers Cain and Abel. It recalled SCP-343, the entity claiming to be the Abrahamic God, launching an assault of earth-shattering destruction and divine wrath. But 343 nor the brothers were able to match SCP-1915. When they stared into SCP-1915's lack of a gaze, they all faded into nothing, much like the rest of the world that had turned to dust as a result of the Absence. SCP-1915 then recalled encountering two forms of SCP-2845, the god Pangloss, both of which were powerful, mighty, and all-consuming, but they had form, and their being knelt before SCP-1915 like everything else did. The Absence withstood their presence, like it had done with everything before them. For years, the Foundation continued to send every anomaly in its possession after SCP-1915, but they paled in comparison to the power of the Absence. And eventually, the Foundation was out of anomalies. The Foundation was out of time as well. SCP-1915's march to the ends of the Earth brought it to a single remaining human settlement, a coalition of survivors that had cooped themselves up in hopes of outrunning the entity. Some were former agents of the Foundation, others were members of various groups of interest, but as you might have expected, they didn't hold a candle to SCP-1915. In an act of defiance against the world that it had been keeping itself from, SCP-1915 wiped the city from the Earth. And then it was truly alone. And now all SCP-1915 had to do was think back to what had occurred and how much longer the rest of the universe had before it, too, succumbed to the absence. Quiet, small, bereft of heroics and great deeds, free of pretensions of great meaning. One night there was a human race on the planet Earth. The next there wasn't, and that was that. The stars do not wait for you, brother. When you took my power, when you burned yourself in the skies above, they looked upon you and felt nothing. The stars did not wait for humanity, for all the promise it showed, for all the promise others saw in them. But what of the absence? What of me? We are, I am, by all accounts and possible qualifications, the greatest monster this world has ever saw. Perhaps that any world saw. And yet, brother, I see now that the stars wait for us. For me, where is the justice in that? Seek it not, for there is none. But the fact remains, brother, the stars do not wait for you, but they wait for me. To take them into my embrace, I suspect I shall not be long.
Welcome, dear viewers, to another tale of excitement and intrigue from the archives of the SCP Foundation. Today we're covering a peculiar story titled Foundation Facilities and How to Loot Them. Our story opens on Shock, a member of SCP-4799, frantically running for her life. SCP-4799, in case you aren't already aware, is a group of smugglers also known by the name Mariachi's Merchants. Now, the merchants aren't your average, everyday, under-the-table traders, mind you. This group is capable of trans-universal travel. Stealing advanced technology from other universes, members of Mariachi's Merchants will then sell these devices to turn a profit. Each of these members, of which there are believed to be 7, originally come from a separate universe outside of our own. And Shock? She's one of the best. Blaster in her hand, Shock ran down the corridor, stopping at a T-shaped intersection, frantically trying to decide which way to turn next. The energy weapon in her hand was still warm to the touch. She'd only just fired it down to the last 12 shots, 13 if she was lucky. There was only meant to be one life form nearby, the only other living thing in a 2-kilometer radius, but Shock had quickly learned that she was far from alone. 2 things wearing lab coats. Things that had perhaps once been human beings were shambling their way closer to her. The nearest door was locked, protected by a keypad, but there was no time to hack her way inside. Letting out a growl, Shock turned and opened fire on her pursuers, the pair of creatures that hadn't registered as life forms, but were still inexplicably alive. Energy bolts spat from her blaster, disintegrating them both in an instant. Turning her focus to the nearby door, Shock pushed a thin black device into a keycard slot, connected to a thin screen that controlled it. She grumbled about how what had seemed like a simple scavenging mission had gone south so quickly. The planet appeared to be dead, at least from the perspective of the Mariachi's merchant ship in orbit. What was the worst that could happen? Turns out losing communication with her crew, for one. They'd been radio silent after the ship was reportedly fired upon. The merchants had promised to come back for Shock once they'd shaken off whoever was shooting at them. The facility she was trying to scavenge had once belonged to the SCP Foundation, presumably a long time ago, codenamed Site-101. Built under a spacecraft launch compound, it should have been a gold mine filled with all sorts of valuable technology. But so far, it didn't seem like there was anything left in the facility that justified the dangerous trip. The keypad flashed green as the door unlocked. Shock collected up her hacking device as the door opened, and one of the creatures appeared on the other side. Reacting with incredible speed, Shock blasted the creature into dust, cursing at its body as it disintegrated atom by atom. What were these things? And why did the merchant's sensors not read them as life forms? She pushed the question to the back of her mind. There was a time and place to contemplate what could be classified as alive, and this was neither. Hurtling down the newly opened corridor, Shock headed towards an open office door. Hiding as quietly as possible in the office, making sure the door was secure enough that those horrors outside wouldn't follow her, Shock took a moment to calm herself. She sat herself down on a leather chair in front of the dark wood desk that filled most of the space in the office. It had belonged to one Dr. Dwyer, according to the computer that stood atop the desk, which Shock began to hack into, once again using her keycard cracking device.
After about a half an hour working through some very sophisticated security software, she eventually managed to force her way into the computer and started clicking through its files. The first thing she uncovered in a folder that was conveniently labeled Important was an email from the O5 command to the director of this abandoned former Foundation site, along with other high-ranking members of personnel. The subject simply read, "Farewell." In the email, O5-7 mentioned that the last number of escape ships had successfully launched from Site 101 and arrived at colony stations. It seemed that some kind of war was imminent and would ravage the entire Earth, leaving nothing behind. So, in their infinite wisdom, the SCP Foundation had been using its vast resources to evacuate its personnel off-world. Meanwhile, the personnel at Site 101 would stay at their posts, perhaps to repopulate or rebuild the Earth after the impending war had passed. That email had been sent in the year 2217, a whole 18 years before Shock had arrived at this facility hoping to raid it. The next email in the folder was headed with the words "Intruder," sent just under a month before. A pair of Foundation security personnel, Officer Sanchez and Meche, had happened across a breach in the ventilation system. According to their reports, it looked as if someone or something had forced its way in with some kind of metal implement. Shortly after, a third officer, Officer Peterson, failed to respond to a radio check seemingly going missing. Security had been advised to travel in groups and engage any unknown entity with lethal force. Something had made its way into the facility, and it had arrived just before Shock did. Uneasy, still not sure what had happened here, the dimension-hopping scavenger read on. The third and final email entry had been sent the day after the last. This time, security had a better idea of what they were up against. Surveillance footage from within the facility had revealed the intruder to be none other than SCP-049. It had claimed the lives of multiple security officers, with 2 of them confirmed to have been instances of SCP-049-2. Being from a different universe, however, Shock had no idea what an SCP-049 was, nor did she like the idea of being trapped with one. Now, in case you, like Shock, haven't heard of the infamous Plague Doctor, then here's a brief bit of context on SCP-049. A tall figure, shrouded in long black robes, a hood over his head, with only a white, beaked mask protruding from underneath. These aren't just parts of his attire, though. The SCP Foundation discovered that all of the pieces of SCP-049's outfit are part of his physical body, made out of muscle and bone. The Plague Doctor's primary goal is to find those he deems to be infected with something he refers to as the Pestilence. If he ever senses this affliction, he will attempt to make direct skin contact with the person carrying it. SCP-049's touch is lethal, killing anyone who comes into contact with him in a matter of minutes. You might think that's all the Plague Doctor does, going from person to person, killing them via touch, but you would be wrong. Once he has killed the victim, SCP-049 then begins performing a crude, outdated form of surgery on their corpse. Using equipment he produces from his mysterious medical bag, he injects a number of unknown chemicals into a person's carcass, eventually turning them into an instance of SCP-049-2. In other words, a zombie. And that's exactly what it had done to at least 2 of the Site 101 security officers. When Shock delved further into the computer, examining some security footage, not only did she watch a monstrosity in a shredded security uniform shambling through a corridor, but there was something else following it. A figure, completely clad in black robes, its face shrouded behind an eerie beaked mask. Shock decided her best course of action was to find out as much as she could about SCP-049. Then, using the facility's security cameras to figure out the quickest route to find any propulsion tech that the Foundation might have left lying around. She familiarized herself with the Foundation's extensive file on SCP-049, learning what the Plague Doctor could do. The part Shock found to be particularly unsettling was knowing that the entity could shut down an organism's biological functions whenever it made direct skin contact. Best to try and avoid him, she told herself. Studying the camera feeds, Shock noticed SCP-049-2s that had all been the former staff of this facility. They didn't seem to move around much, unless provoked. All she had to do was make it through the corridors to a door labeled Propulsion Testing, without the -2s noticing her. Sounds easy in theory, and it would have been easier in practice if there weren't currently 8 of the zombies standing in her path to the testing room. With a tight grip around her blaster, Shock bolted from the office, barreling at full sprint down the corridor. She already knew from watching the cameras that the first of the SCP-049-2s was around the nearest corner. Opening fire, she went speeding past its remains as it turned into little more than a smoldering pile on the floor. Around the next corner were another 2 of the creatures, dispatched as quickly as the first with a bright blue crackle of the energy weapon. So far, so good. But Shock was already anticipating seeing a group of 5 SCP-049-2s huddled together, the next obstacle in her way. Sure enough, she had navigated her way through the facility's hallways towards them, making sure she had the element of surprise on her side. She blasted the oncoming mob of zombies, screaming as they were struck by the blue light of her blaster, only to vanish, vaporized forever. All except for the 5th and final SCP-049-2 instance. Shock had fired her 5th shot too soon, missing the last of the creatures. She waited for it to close the distance between them, hoping for a closer target, but the monstrosity knocked the gun from her hands. Shock pulled a fusion bomb from her bag. Wrapping the unstable energy cell in her coat, she let the creature grab the makeshift bomb from her, picking up her weapon and running as the bomb detonated. Exhausted, she reached the propulsion testing room, injured after her fight with the Dash-2. Shock had hoped her troubles were over, and for a moment they certainly seemed to be. She had stumbled across a motherlode of tech, modified reality anchors, and all kinds of equipment that would be perfect salvage. But then, from the shadows, something new stepped forward. The Plague Doctor himself. Shock drew her blaster again and pulled the trigger, but the weapon was spent, sparking in her hands as it failed to fire. Frozen, she stared at SCP-049, and it stared back. Lowering her weapon, Shock tried to calmly introduce herself to the looming cloaked anomaly. I'm Shock. Nice to meet you. Or rather, these people call you SCP-49, right? Sure did a bang-up job of carrying everyone in here from the looks of things. For a moment, they talked. SCP-049 had heard the Foundation personnel at Site-101 talking of being the last men on Earth, and made its way into the facility to save them, as he put it, ridding them of the Pestilence. Shock explained that the rest of the planet's surface outside had been severely irradiated, and that there was no one living up top anymore, all while sneakily sliding pieces of expensive-looking tech into her bag. SCP-049 argued that there were still people left on Earth, that Site-42 housed the very last remnants of humanity, but they had been untouched by disease. They were pure, but Shock didn't care one bit. Instead, she made a move nobody would have expected. She offered the Plague Doctor a lift. The Mariachi's merchants would be coming back for her soon, and their ship was able to take them anywhere in the multiverse. After pondering for a moment, SCP-049 asked to be taken with them, to find where the rest of the sick were. Unwilling to accept his work was done. As long as you agree to keep your hands to yourself, Shock told him, as a gray orb appeared in the room, hovering above the floor without touching the ceiling. It was time to leave.
Being on SCP-173 detail isn't easy. These duties of strict observation fall on a bi-weekly basis when SCP-173's enclosure needs to be cleaned. The reddish-brown substance on the floor is a natural output of SCP-173, a combination of feces and blood. While the Foundation has put up with a lot of depraved behavior from its SCPs, it draws the line at poor hygiene. They routinely send in a crew of 3 D-Class personnel to clean up the mess. But the bigger chore isn't the scrubbing and mopping at all, but rather keeping SCP-173 docile. To do so, the line of sight must not be broken at any time with SCP-173. Personnel assigned to enter the container are instructed to alert one another before blinking. If this protocol is not followed, SCP-173 attacks by snapping the neck at the base of the skull. It is, at its core, a high-stakes staring contest. The crew is intelligently divided into their tasks. Only one of them actually has janitorial duties, and even then, the mopper's most relevant skill isn't even related to cleaning at all. His greatest strength must be his ability to trust other people. As he takes his mop to the floor, he hands over his life to his crew, who protect him with their focus and attention on SCP-173. It is without a doubt one of the cruelest and most stressful jobs anyone could ever have. But not every horror story is found in the trenches of terror. Those with mops on the front lines have their work cut out for them. But even the researchers with their warm lab coats and boring bureaucratic obligations aren't safe from danger. This is the story of Jake Skoll.
a researcher who, for reasons we will tactfully tease you with until the video's witty end, has been reassigned to SCP-173. Director Fordham brought the bad news like a bag of coal. "You're being reassigned," he said, with a slight smirk on his face, continuing to be preoccupied with his paperwork, as if this news was secondary to what he was doing right there and then. But it wasn't secondary to Jack Skull. It was the center of their life. No, not even just the center. It was the center, peripheral, and outer bounds of their life. Their assignments were everything, and everything was about to change. A pregnant silence followed the announcement. Jake Skull couldn't find a response, and they weren't even sure there was one to be found, no matter how deep they dug. What came out wasn't as much of a retort as a reaction, that involuntary bodily response to events that weren't expected, that awkward and afraid muttering of fear and confusion. What? I'm being, I'm to be reassigned. Is that what you're saying? Researcher Skull blinked a few times, confused. Their feet sunk into the deep forest green shag on the floor. A spectrum of thoughts cascaded through their mind as they searched harder and harder for a reason, digging deeper and deeper, only to find another treasure chest full of nothing. Is my work not sufficient on SCP? Director Fordham looked up and gave them the fixed, pointed stare they'd grown to dread over the past 6 months. Of course not, Jake. I recognize what you've done, and we want to put you somewhere I feel you deserve. And serve the Foundation, of course. We're putting you on a very important and special object. Again, Fordham gave that smirk. That damn smirk. Sure, his words and tone presented themselves as the truth, but his face said otherwise. The devious positioning of his lip suggested that there was a layer of sinister subtext to his speech. But Jake Skull couldn't pick up on the cues. There's no room to read someone else's poker face when all of your attention is on the crappy hand you've just been dealt. Jake Skull's eyes fell to the desk. Reassigned. The word rang like church bells. Why, God? Their work with SCP-3872 as a consultant chemist was going slowly, to be truthful, but they didn't think it was to the point that they needed reassignment. All right. Which project am I assigned to? The time between the question and the answer was the longest of Jake's life. The uncertainty felt like an eternity. Fordham tapped a few symbols accessing Skull's profile and added an entry in their security clearance. He hastily swiped away all the other files listed and turned back to face Skull. You have access to it now. Please get on the first plane to Site 19. Your dormitory contents are already packed up. Jake reached into their pocket to check the notification on their cell phone. SCP-3872, file removed. SCP-2593, file removed. SCP-173, file added. They turned around and walked slowly through the corridors, towards the transportation hub on the outskirts of the site. They opened the file on their phone and quickly scanned the oddly phrased report, attempting to make sense of what they were reading. Skull's eyebrows raised to the heavens as they noticed the timestamp on Containment. SCP-173 was one of the first, one of the few objects that the Foundation came to possess through some organization or another without losing its information. They tried their best to remain optimistic in their interpretation of these new life events. And for a moment, they thought, this might be a good thing for me. Swiping down, they came to the section about assigned researchers, the people whose steps they would be following in, and where were those steps leading them? The list was impressive, from Dr. Kondraki to Dr. Bright. These people were all legends in their own right, and so if they could just follow their footsteps, they reasoned they would end their journey in a good place. They imagined their new career path straight to the top of this mountain of success. Maybe they would become the face of the Foundation. Maybe they would accomplish so much that they'd had a statue erected in their honor that people travel far and wide to visit and take pictures with. Maybe this would be a good thing, they wanted to think. I need the first plane to Site 19, they said with confidence. I've been reassigned. And so Jake Skull took to the air and clung to the stream as long as they could. But no matter how heavy a sleeper, reality shakes everyone awake eventually. 6 years later, Jake Skull could hear the years pass, But not only could they hear it, they could feel it. Their body was decaying in a way inconsistent with our biological understanding of age. SCP-173, the legendary object. The first, the original, the statue. It was chipping away at the soul of Jake Skoll. It was carving a statue of its own, hacking at stone until it was nothing. And that's what Jake Skoll felt like. Nothing. It was torture. When they arrived, they quickly reviewed the research materials. Every word had become burned into their memory, all 233 words of them. The additional research materials turned out to be a few scribbled pages by bored researchers. A few had made hypotheses that had all turned out to be nonsense.
There was a locked filing cabinet, but every time Skoll requested it be opened, maintenance told them that the control room was designated low priority, and they would get to it eventually.
Over the past 6 years, Jake Skoll had made 18 separate transfer requests. They wanted out, but all of them had been denied. It was as if they were in high school again, asking dates to prom and getting hit with no thank yous, feeling none of the politeness backed into their syntax, understanding only the brutal reality of the phrase, no. They were stuck here, technically a level 3 staff now, but without any rights to view or work on any other objects. They were given a promotion, but it withheld all the perks and benefits that come with it. They were stuck in a loop of pats on the back. People extended them their hand, but it was always with an empty palm, giving them nothing to hold on to but a gesture. They were assigned a staff of 4, 3 D-class, all of which were older men, and a lazy level 2 security officer who slouched in his office chair, meeting the bare minimum requirements to be considered a living human being. The D-class were all quite docile. They came in once a week, mopped the floor, mumbled "clear" to each other, and left. They lived within this exact structure. No new days became an unspoken motto. These recurring 24 hours passed slowly. If there were no clocks to prove the passing of time, they would have every reason to believe it had frozen over. But occasionally, ever so occasionally, the day would deviate just slightly. They'd hear something, a scrape, and the sounds of movement. Jake would flip open the observation ports on the double concrete lock and examine SCP-173, but Jake could take offense to such language. Examining might be the wrong word. More accurately, they would just look at it, because there was nothing to examine. There was nothing to observe. SCP-173 was already understood. Michael Jordan doesn't take a microscope to the ball every time he plans to dribble. He knows every detail of it by heart. His fingertips know the grooves. His hand-eye coordination knows how to control it. His right arm's built-in apt for physics knows exactly how much force to put into each shot and at what trajectory to aim. We are told to learn something new every day. But the truth is, there comes a day when the learning stops, when we know all that we will ever know. And this felt true to Jake. They understood SCP-173. There was nothing more for them to see. It was just concrete, rebar, and some spray paint. That was it. And that was all that it would ever be. There was nothing to find, nothing to determine, nothing for the researcher to research. Their job was done, but they kept having to work it. Their identity no longer fit, but they kept having to put it on each and every morning. When Jake first got there, they collected samples of the concrete, some of the rebar, some spray paint. They were determined to find something worthy of research. After 4 weeks, they'd gotten sick of getting no replies from admin, and they cracked the locks on the filing cabinet, finding the research notes of all the previous researchers. All of the legendary doctor's notes turned out to be doodles and random to-do lists which had nothing to do with the object. After 6 weeks, they gave up on taking samples. After 8 weeks, they brought a Game Boy. After 10, they started bringing in anything they could to pass the time. A yo-yo, a collection of short stories, a packet of hot sauce they felt bad throwing away, a piece of string to cut off circulation to their index finger for no other reason than to make sure they were still a human relying on blood. Oh yes, Jake Skoll was bored. So very bored. They thought if anyone could bring the phrase "bored to death" to fruition, it would be them. These days, they shuffled in, waved at the guard, and sat down at their little control room where there was a terminal, which, by the way, didn't have an internet connection.
and tried to stay sane. Fast forward a few years and Jake barely fit into his chair. To clarify, no, they did not purchase a new tiny chair out of boredom. They got fat out of boredom. Their life brought them no joy, and so what they couldn't get from living, they searched for in eating. But there was no fulfillment to be found at the center of the Tootsie Pop. Jake stood with a grunt as the light came on, and the 3D class were escorted to the control room with the mops and buckets in tow. "Thanks, Jimmy," was the only conversation they had with the new security staff. The old guard had retired sometime in the 8th year. Honestly, Jake couldn't even remember. The D-class had gotten older too, most of them now gray-haired but still assigned to the project. The security guard walked over and thumbed towards the break room. "Hey Jake, I'm gonna get coffee. If anything happens, seal the door, you know the drill. Just keep an eye on the Ds." Jake buzzed the doors open and stood inside the doorframe, keeping their eyes on the statue most of the time, but wandering over the containment chamber. A long time ago, they might have been concerned, but the D-classes they worked with weren't very violent. Frankly, they had worked with these men long enough that they extended a small measure of trust. All of them did their jobs without complaining and never had made a mistake in 10 years. While the years of repetition wore them out, the job itself didn't even feel like labor. They had perfected the art of the staring contest. They were confident, and they had reason to be. As the years went on, although they collected no new data on SCP-173, they did collect evidence that they were capable of containing it. While they learned nothing new of importance about SCP-173, they learned about themselves. They learned that they were a good crew, and it was because of this confidence, even if rightfully earned, that success crumbled. When in a room with SCP-173, you have to assume everything will go wrong, because anything can go wrong, and eventually it will. And when that time comes, you have to be prepared. Procedure said Jake had to have someone armed in the room with any D-class. Jake looked down at their hip, double-checked the pistol there. They knew how to use it, but figured he never would have to draw it. The routine cleaning began. Clear, clear, clear. It was the same old, until suddenly it wasn't. Clear, clear. Oh no, I think I'm having a snap. What? Hey Nick, are you? Snap. Oh god, no, I don't wanna. Snap. Jake's eyes shot up as the statue stood inches away. Its green eyes stared directly into their soul. In their periphery, Jake could see the 3D class with their head turned at odd angles. Jake desperately reached out for the emergency containment button on the wall. They hadn't ever had to use it, and it was supposed to be easy to find, but of course, it wasn't. They recalled the manual saying, "Move your hand anywhere along the right-hand wall. The button takes up most of the wall. It will seal off the containment chamber and SCP-173 from breaching containment." They moved their hand exactly how their memory of the manual instructed him, but it wasn't there. There was nothing to press. There was nothing to save them. Jake's hands grew desperate and their eyes began to water. Just as they started to close, a last thought crossed their mind. Move your hand anywhere along the left-hand wall. The button takes up most of the wall. It will seal off the containment chamber and SCP-173 from breaching containment. Of course, a classic mix-up. 50-50 chances never favored the flustered. Their fight-or-flight instincts were contradicting each other. Was reaching for a button fighting, or was it flighting? They were in their head, deep in trenches of overthinking. Finally, they regained their composure. Their hand darted out to the left and they started to push down on the button. The red of the emergency button filled their vision as the green eyes of SCP-173 slipped just barely out of snap. Director Kinsley stood outside of the meeting room a few minutes before the weekly briefing in the Site-2117 Administrative Wing. Fordham, do you remember Jake Skoll? Oh yeah, sure do. Just got a report from 19. Looks like there was a breach and they bid it. Fordham waved off a few colleagues who were about to enter the meeting room. His conversation with Director Kinsley wasn't over. He went on to tell him that he was just about to approve Jake Skoll's transfer. After all these years, Jake had been sending requests to leave SCP-173. Their wish was about to be granted, but instead they were reassigned to the grave. What a cruel twist, isn't it? That is, of course, if it were actually true. Fordham gave his patented smirk. Just kidding. The only researchers to ever get out of that post needed friends in very high places. Skoll, to his detriment, did not. So what exactly did Skoll do to deserve this? It is known that those who are sent to SCP-173 have made mistakes. If you disrespect your boss, you might be reassigned to SCP-173. If you don't follow Foundation policy, you might be reassigned to SCP-173. If you leak information to the public, you might be reassigned to SCP-173. If you are Jake Skrull, however, it doesn't take quite as much. So I will pose the question once more. What horrible thing could Jake have done? Could they have been plotting to help an array of SCPs escape? Could they have been smuggling dangerous equipment from the lab and selling it on the black market? Could they have somehow been responsible for every casualty in Foundation history? Or could it have been something much, much smaller? Like occasionally parking in their boss's favorite spot on Site-217. A lot, you must understand, which doesn't have assigned parking. The SCP Foundation's most famous anomalies are legendary. From the notorious 682 and its acid bath to Pesterbot, some SCPs are instantly recognizable from only an image or a few sentences of information. But the SCP Foundation also encompasses endless universes and possibilities, and that means endless variations on these iconic anomalies. Maybe in one reality, 173 is simply one of many terrifying statues, or perhaps 682 is an heir to the infamous Infernal Scarlet King. And of course, there are other versions of the Foundation itself too. From worlds where they are known as the Foundation Incorporated and seek only to line their own pockets, to realities where the Foundation is a theocratic organization holding the line after the apocalypse. What follows is a peek into one such alternate universe and their version of one of the Foundation's most mysterious and enigmatic anomalies. Can you guess what it is? Some people think that the Foundation operations are limited to land, air, and sea. To some extent, they're right. While the vast majority of anomalies exist on Earth, the O5 Council knows that space is infinite, and that means infinite possibilities for other anomalies. That's why the Foundation has sites on the Moon, on space stations orbiting the Earth, even installations on Venus and Mars. There are even rumors that the Foundation retains their very own small fleet of space shuttles to move some of the particularly dangerous anomalies off-planet, where they pose no risk to society. But space goes well beyond just our neighboring planets. The Foundation also invests heavily into exploring deep space, so that they might find anomalies like the hateful star before they pose a danger, rather than after. To this end, they've sent a small army of space probes, equipped with advanced sensors and rudimentary artificial intelligence, in every direction away from our planet to scout for potential anomalies. But the issue is that sometimes the probes actually end up encountering anomalies. Such is the curious case of Probe H9, which disappeared under mysterious circumstances while scouting a potential anomaly in a completely empty, barren region of deep space. The Foundation assigns an internal investigator to the case, one Geoffrey Davies, who schedules a sit-down with Isaac Miles, the chief technician in charge of the probe and many others under Foundation command. Probe H9's AI system, known as PH9, was in communication with Miles throughout its strange journey, right up until the end. The logs requested by Davies are read out. At first, it seems like a routine signal. PH9 calls into base to inform them that it has detected a signal, but not just any signal. An emergency SOS signal coming from deep in an otherwise empty quadrant of space. Despite having two sensors, the probe is unable to find anything in that area with its telescope. Miles authorizes the probe to change its route to pass through where the signal is coming from, and PH9 confirms that it will arrive at the source of the SOS in 399 hours, or 17 days. The two men exchange some words. Miles explains he does not contact his superiors because protocol means they need visual confirmation before sending a space shuttle in, and PH9's telescope couldn't find anything. Even though the signal was confirmed to be human, Miles didn't want to break protocol and let the probe go in alone. Investor Davies begrudgingly agrees that it was a smart decision, and they move on. An hour after PH9 entered the quadrant of space where the signal was coming from, Miles is still waiting for a report. Finally, he contacts PH9, which informs him that it is still unable to get a look at where the signal is coming from. Even though it is so close, it will arrive in 4 hours. Miles, confused by how this is possible, asks it for its readings on its weight and gravity. The investigator asks him why he wanted this information, and Miles explains that the probe passed through some kind of event horizon. The probe was continuing to move into the quadrant, but for some reason looked like it wasn't. This happens when something enters a black hole, but if it was a black hole, PH9 would have been unable to transmit and completely destroyed. Some kind of anomaly has trapped PH9 inside its massive well of gravity. When Miles again radioed into PH9, the probe had a strange response, that it would pass by the signal source in 4 hours, the exact same as last time. Something was obviously wrong with the probe. As well, over 4 hours had passed, and the probe signal meant it should be right next to the source. Miles decides the probe is faulty and assigns probe J4 to meet it and take it to a repair facility. But when probe J4 arrives, PH9 can't see it. PH9 can't even detect it using any other kind of sensor, but it does detect the same SOS signal, and against all logic, it is still 4 hours away. PH9 tries to offer its coordinates, but it can't. In fact, it says that its current coordinates are outside of Euclidean space, like so many non-Euclidean anomalies the Foundation deals with. Miles can't decide whether PH9 has fallen into a gravity well or something much, much worse has happened, and PH9 holds position. Miles explains that then he called his superiors to let them know the deeply strange events occurring in relation to their probes. But the closest team was a week away. By the time they arrived on scene to investigate, it was all over. They couldn't advise on what to do about the probe. There were far too many unknowns in relation to space anomalies. And so Miles simply told PH9 to continue on its course and report back every hour, because there was nothing else to do and nothing to lose. The last hour of reports are where things suddenly take a sharp turn. PH9 calls into command, saying that it is suddenly detecting a massive object almost 1,000,000 kilometers away from it. The signal source is still 4 hours away, but this new object is some sort of planetoid, 1,400 kilometers across, and incredibly light for its size. For comparison, the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs was 10 kilometers across. PH9 moves to get a better look, but its analysis keeps failing, because it's getting closer. Not just that, but getting closer impossibly quickly. In a minute, it's suddenly 400,000 kilometers away. 30 seconds later, and it's 250,000 kilometers, and showing no signs of slowing down. Before Miles can explain why this is impossible, the probe reports that it is about to collide with the planetoid. The last message it transmits before all communications cease is a single image from its telescope, showing whatever was about to crash into the probe. A massive, blurry white sphere, completely featureless against the starless backdrop. The men are confused. Neither of them know what this image means. By all evidence, the probe was rocketing through empty space way too fast for anything to catch up to it. And yet, something obviously did. Something was chasing the probe. They agree it wasn't a rogue planet, and Davies dismisses Miles with some words of advice to start taking his vacation time and head on home after a final debriefing. Turning to his aide, he instructs the agent to file the interview and completely quarantine the quadrant of space, making sure nothing enters and exits, and ominously, to ensure that Miles gets processed. The Foundation does not leave loose ends untied after all. Have you managed to figure out what anomaly that this is a parallel version of? Something going into a contained endless space, towards a human signal at the bottom that seems to never be getting closer, before suddenly being consumed by a blurry white thing? That's right. It's the infamous and notorious SCP-087, the Endless Staircase. Many of us are familiar with this anomaly. We should be, considering how dangerous and ominous it is to even seasoned Foundation veterans. A metal door in the back of a high school campus, leading down and down and down, endlessly into an inky black void where a bone-chilling weeping and crying of a baby coming from the bottom, teasing people to try and find the source. At first, the Foundation were only interested in finding out where exactly this crying was coming from. But soon they realized, just like Miles, that something was very, very wrong. The first explorer they sent in, an older man, had gone down only a few flights when he heard the crying and sobbing of a baby 200 meters away. Spooked, he was instructed against his protest to continue descending the dark, damp staircase. Almost 30 flights down, he suddenly realized the next landing wasn't empty like the others. In front of him was a grotesque parody of a head, an alabaster white face with no mouth or nostrils, and blank, empty, white eyes, just floating feet above the ground, staring at that thing. Despite his terror, the subject began to approach, just before it suddenly shot up the stairs, going right for his face. By the time he reached the top of the stairs after a panicked, hysterical run, he collapsed face down on the concrete. The Foundation's following attempts fared a little better. In one, the D-Class had descended almost 100 flights of stairs when he encountered the face. Doing nothing, they simply stared at each other, right up until the face again shot up toward him. He turned and ran, screaming all the way up the stairs. Unlike the first subject, he didn't manage to make it out of SCP-087 before he collapsed. His heart stopped, and the Foundation prepared to send in a recovery mission, until suddenly, his heartbeat restarted, but with an abnormal, unnatural heartbeat. The subject's limp form then calmly walked up the stairs to the exit, closed the door, sat down, and fell into a vegetative state, slipping into a permanent coma. In the next, everything seemed to be going well, until the subject entered a strange hole in the landing with a light at the bottom. Shrugging, she continues all the way to the 500th landing, almost 2 kilometers below ground, when she decides to go back up against orders. Turning around, she is shocked by the presence of the face only a few inches behind her head. It had been following her down those stairs for who knows how long, and this time, it's not staring at her. It's staring at the researchers behind the screens of her camera. In terror, she runs down the stairs, looking behind her after several hundred feet, only to see the face still barely a foot behind her, staring into the camera with a dead-eyed glare. By the time she realizes that the sound of the crying is getting closer, she's already stumbled and fallen down into the hard concrete, knocking herself unconscious. The last thing the researchers see before the camera cuts out is the face making piercing eye contact with them. And, of course, the infamous 4th exploration. Whatever occurred in the final descent into SCP-087 was so concerning to the Foundation that they opted to seal all logs of it and expunge all the data. We may never truly know what lies at the bottom of the staircase, or what the face wants from people who enter its territory. Just like how we may never know what exactly Probe H9 was being signaled by, or what the massive object moving at the speed of light directly into the probe was. And just like how the Foundation cleaned up all the remains of Exploration 4, the Foundation also plans to make sure Miles cannot tell anyone about this strange deep space anomaly. Now check out SCP-1548 The Star, the Hateful for another space-based anomaly, or for more from the depths of SCP-087, watch The Secret at the Bottom of SCP-087 Explained.